Okay. We call this meeting of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order, and I'll introduce myself. I'm John McGlennon. I chair TSDAC and am a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors this year, serving as chairman of the board. And I'll first welcome Sam Sink with us for the first of our meetings. Sam, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Sam Sink. I'm the Director of Planning and Scheduling at GRTC, formerly of HRT. I just started back in January, so excited to be appointed to TSDAC and work with you all.
Great, thanks, Sam. And while we have already had the benefit of Brian being a member, we haven't been able to do it in person yet. Would you go ahead and introduce yourself, Brian?
Certainly. I'm Brian Booth. I'm the Director of Transit in Blacksburg, Virginia, and also representing CTV as their appointee on this committee.
And Kate, of course, good to see you again.
Thank you. So I'm Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the
And Cindy, our Vice Chair.
Good morning, everybody. Cindy Mester, Deputy City Manager for City of Falls Church in my day job and representing DML here today.
And I should mention that I represent VACO here as well. And I think we're going to see our Director, Jennifer Mitchell, a little bit later on, and Jamie Jackson and Mr. Dyke will be coming along, we hope. And it's great to be back in person right now. And I'll turn things over now to Jennifer DeBrule.
So in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get started. Today, I would like to look at today's agenda as kind of a good morning.
Hello, how are you? Glad to be starting.
Yeah, right here. Today is really kind of a regroup and reorganize meeting for us. We met virtually in 2020 and in 2021. Now 2022. Yeah, it's been a long time. I think our last in-person meeting was like late in 2019. So we have been apart essentially for most of the implementation of the reform package that this group worked so hard to put in place. So we're at a strange place because we're, I hope, coming out of a pandemic and looking at what we can do collectively to support the industry as we come out of that and how that works with our capital and operating formula. So today we're going to kind of regroup, reset. Haley, I can't just say thank you. So today we're gonna really just kind of take a step back, look at what lies ahead. We're at that point in our process where we need to look at what we've done, how it's worked, and potentially make some recommendations and tweaks going forward. So we have that ahead of us. So I'll go through some work plan stuff, but before I do, Andy Wright, who's our Manager of Policy and Communications, is going to talk about what's happened in the legislative session. After I talk about the work plan, I think in addition to the work that this group has done over the past couple of years, working with our staff and looking at the implementation of merit, we also have two very informative studies that have occurred over the past year that have really also helped to inform the work that we have ahead of us. The first is JLARC's Transportation Infrastructure and Funding Report. That came out in November. We're very fortunate to have Mark Ribben with us today to present on his work and the recommendations that came out of that to TSDAC and to DRPT. And in addition to that, we also have the HJ 542 Transit Equity and Modernization Study. That study, we presented interim findings to General Assembly in December. Grant Sparks, who's our Director of Transit Planning, is going to give you a briefing on that and kind of where that study is going as it wraps up, is on track to wrap up this summer. And then we'll kind of close out today with kind of our next steps and look forward. So if it's the pleasure of the group, we'll just keep on going. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. We do have another new TSDAC member. It's not here today, but we've asked Dr. Smoot, who is on the Commonwealth Transportation Board representing Salem District, to join us as well. And so that's in process right now. He has the benefit of already having seen the JLARC report and the Transit Equity and Modernization, so he'll be joining us starting next month, and Sam's with us as well. So really grateful to have our TSDAC team filled back out again. All right, so Andy, want to take it from there?
Yeah. Thank you.
I've 2 years worth of being in this room, and I don't know the answer to that, Andy. So whatever you want to do is fine.
Why not? Well, I'm staying when you can say. Winston Churchill. So I'm just going to give a quick update on what's been going on in DC and Richmond as it pertains to transit. So I'll start by talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Infrastructure Week finally arrived in DC late last year, and it authorized $1.2 trillion in funding, $550 billion of that in new funding, and it reauthorized several existing programs, gave an additional substantial amount of funding to those programs, and then also created some new programs. So what did that mean for us? STA, that first column you see FY21 is the actual numbers, $12.9 billion. This is nationwide. And you're seeing a jump, I think it's about 58%, up to $21 billion in FY22, and of course that'll grow over the 5 years of the program. $107.9 billion over the 5 years, $45 billion of that is new funding, both formula and discretionary. And then our friends on the rail side are getting $66 billion in funding. So a lot of money going out the door. First, let's talk about discretionary grant funding, just focusing on the CIG program and bus facilities and low-no. CIG, $3 billion annually nationwide. That's a 30% increase. And that second bullet is a list of the types of programs that can apply for that funding. Bus facilities and low-no. You notice the funding opportunity went out this week on that. There's a 30% increase in funding for those programs, which amounts to about $1 billion in new funding for low-no. The next couple of bullets are some of the requirements. 25% dedicated for low emission, 15% going to rural programs, and zero emission projects must have a transition plan. So what does that mean here for us in Virginia? Some potential opportunities. Here are a list of some projects that are in the pipeline for CIG, with the first two bullets there. And then the last bullet there are a list of some programs for bus facilities and low-no. You'll see it's a wide variety, and happy to say all across the Commonwealth, not just focused on one region. Here at DRPT, we're getting prepared for this. Right now, we have a position out for a grant and communication specialist that closes today for that person to help with these applications, not just for applications that DRPT is going to apply for, but also to help the transit agencies themselves with their applications. So we're very excited to close this today. So if you know anyone that's interested, tell them to apply today.
Hey, Andy, can we pause there for just a second? As it pertains to the work of this group, I think one of the things that we need to talk about with this influx of additional money is how that money plays with the state program and the state funding, because what we have seen over the past few years as the state program has grown, we have seen our transit agencies kind of flip the script a little bit, so much so that Region 3 has called us and said, we don't understand what you're doing because people are coming in and asking for 28% federal, and it doesn't make any sense. And so I think we need to talk about, like, how do we incentivize, how do we use the merit funding and the state capital funding to help incentivize and kind of feed the pipeline of projects to pursue this influx of federal money, or match and leverage, and particularly for the smaller agencies. I'll give you an example. Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission has a transfer facility project. What's it, about $1 million?
A little over.
Okay, about $1 million in Stanton. They were concerned about applying for the federal bus and bus facilities money because they didn't know how they would provide the match. And so being able to have something worked into the merit process to get that whole chicken and egg thing worked out is going to be really important. So I don't want to mess up Andy's group, but I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that we're going to have to talk about how we do that and how we use the state program to leverage and bring more of this money back to Virginia. Because I'm not going to get ahead of myself, but we historically have not done very well bringing this, particularly federal discretionary money back.
Yes, I was going to add that, in the past, from what I've seen, it's usually the larger systems that are applying, smaller systems are not, and hopefully having a grant writer on staff that's a resource for those smaller agencies to use and apply.
Since you're already interested in it, and just because I know the space really well, the low and no emission program, it's not 30%, it's actually like 500% increase. I can't even tell you, like, it's normally like a $150 million program. It's $1.5 billion is what the funding announcement just went out, and it is, and that's just this year. So that's definitely an area that there's obviously a lot of federal strings associated with getting federal money, and that's probably where the anxiety in our spot, because we don't do federal grants. But it is like, kind of blow your mind. Like, it literally is just like a token little program, and it's massive. And again, it's capital and it's facilities and or rolling stock. And so we're going to, yeah, I know. You and I can talk about that. I know, we never yeah. But, like one of the strengths with Lono is that you have to have a transition plan. And so one of the things that we've talked about here is what can we do with our planning team to help do that for, in particular, the smaller urban agencies, the rural agencies. I know Kate's working on some, electric planning and zero emission.
Sorry, I shouldn't say electric.
Not necessarily the.
But zero emission planning in Northern Virginia. So I think those are other things that will kind of feed into how we can be prepared to leverage this money going forward. Right.
Talk about formula funding. This table just is an overview of the funding, the formula funding we receive, where it goes to and how it's used. So first two rows, 5307, the large urban, they receive it directly. The next row, that goes to small urban agencies, DRPT receives it and then allocates it according to the FTA guidelines. Next two, 5310 and 5311, DRPT distributes using its merit program. And the 5311F, we use for our intercity bus for Virginia Breeze. And just a shout out with the Virginia Breeze, we're going to use it to study a potential fifth route to go into effect in 2023. It's been an overwhelming success thus far. We started a fourth route out of Bristol in November, and it's been a big success. So how much more formula funding are we getting? Over the next 5 years, approximately $640 million in new funding coming directly to Virginia. I believe the percentage is about 30% increase. Highway Trust Fund, transit gets a small portion of that. That's $290 million, which is a 26% increase. State and repair, $950 million annually. And the bill also reauthorizes a lot of funding. The feds contribute $150 million annually to WMATA, and each jurisdiction has to match that. So Virginia contributes $50 million annually, and that comes off the top of the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. So let's talk about the General Assembly session, which hopefully is going to be tomorrow.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, hopefully. The definition end is sort of.
No wish.
The big item this year that is impacting us is the elimination of the grocery tax. Governor Youngkin proposed a full repeal of the 2.5% tax. And the next three bullets break down where that funding goes. We see about transportation as a whole, 2.5%. The House right now, they're still in the middle of their budget negotiations, so it's all to be determined how this works out. But the House is looking for a full repeal. The Senate wants to do a partial repeal, maintaining the 1% tax for the localities. They're both right now considering plans that would make public education in the localities whole, using some general fund dollars to backfill those dollars. However, there are no plans to replenish the transportation funding. So what that means for us is about a $15 million reduction in revenues for the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund. Very exciting topic here, statewide bus procurement. I will try to explain this in 5 minutes or less. Okay. So the Department of General Services and DRPC, they work together on having a statewide bus procurement contract, and all the local agencies use that contract and work with DRPC to purchase buses. Last year, DGS came to DRPC and said that the contract was not in compliance with state law. The problem being that bus manufacturers selling directly to the consumer, being DRPC and the agencies, meant that the manufacturers needed to have a manufacturer's license and, more importantly, a dealer's license. This all came about because of the Tesla issue in the last 10 years. Tesla sells directly to the consumer, so they need to have a dealer's license. So that's getting a manufacturer's license in Virginia is fairly easy. You just submit an application to the DMV, pay a small fee. The dealer's license is a little bit more complicated. A manufacturer, to get a dealer's license, has to go through the administrative hearing process, have a hearing with the DMV commissioner issues a decision. Being a former hearing officer at the DMV, I can tell you that's a very lengthy process, and it's not necessarily a slam dunk that the commissioner would rule in favor of the manufacturer. So even if they were to have gone through that entire process, the FTA then said, well, if you have them do those requirements, they will be unable to use any federal funds for these capital purchases, which in many cases up to, for the buses you see out here on the street, it's about 28% federal funding. For the paratransit vehicles, we're looking at 80% federal funding. So it would be a big problem, obviously. And the contract that DGS and DRPC had expired in May of 2021. So right now, we've been unable to procure nearly 400 buses in the FY22 set. So we've introduced legislation, SB 281, as well as language in the Caboose bill, HB 29, and the upcoming biennial budget, HB 30, which creates an exemption. So if you're a manufacturer of buses for public transportation purposes, you are exempt from having to get a dealer's and a manufacturer's license. This makes DGS happy, makes DMV, Motor Vehicle Board are happy, FTA is happy, we're happy, everybody's happy. So SB 281 is currently before the governor for his consideration. That bill went through unanimously in both the House and the Senate, and of course, the Caboose bill and the biennial budget are still being negotiated as we speak. The good thing about the language being in the Caboose bill is as soon as the Caboose bill, that is the budget dealing with the current year, so that's FY22. So once the governor signs that, it goes into immediate effect, and we'll be able to put the bus procurement back on the street, and we'll be back in business. And
we have already lined all that up with DGS, and so our team here, Neil Sherman and Avery Daughtry, are working with them to get that procurement out as soon as that bill is signed. So that will get us back up and running. But it's definitely been a painful year-long process, and it's really put us behind a period of time where the manufacturing community is having a hard enough time keeping us anyway.
So do we have an estimate of how many buses are going to be delayed and how long that delay might be?
So we have funded between 400 and 500 since we lost the ability to use our contract. So that's been about a year. So basically everything that was funded in the current FY22 program, and we really had problems starting before that. So it impacted some FY21 funded buses as well. Federal law enables transit agencies to buy off of other state contracts. And so over the past 2 or 3 years, we've worked a lot with Washington State. Interestingly enough, most of the rest of the country was buying off of our contract for both diesel and electric, because we had, early on kind of got caught up in this FAST Act procurement change, and so ours was one of the first state contracts that was really compliant with all of those federal laws, and so a lot of folks were using our contract. We work very closely with folks in Washington State DOT. We have a lot of friends out there, so they basically had taken our contract and what we had learned working with FTA, when we had some issues with our contract, they did the same thing. So when we had this problem, we started we were told we couldn't point people in a certain direction, but we would kind of say, look over there, might find something that would work. So there are some agencies that have chosen to do their own procurements. There are some that have bought off of other state contracts, and then there are some that are waiting for our contracts to come back online. We have been able to keep the contracts for our body on chassis, our low floor, and our minivans active while we work through this. I'm not sure how, but we did. But on those contracts, we've seen pretty significant price increases. So I fully expect that all of these buses that we've funded that haven't been procured yet, we may have to go back and make some budgetary adjustments to those grants to be able to have those projects move forward just based on the climate from the manufacturer's standpoint.
Last topic, Transit Ridership Incentive Program. 6% of the Commonwealth Mass Transit funds goes to this program, where part of the program is regional connectivity programs like long distance commuter bus service, and then the other portion of the program goes to zero fare, low income programs. Two bills introduced this session, changing how the money is distributed. House Bill 142, introduced by Delegate McQuinn here in Richmond. He said, let me back up, I apologize. Right now, a maximum of 25% can be used for reduced or zero fare projects. Delegate McQuinn's bill, so before, it says that at least 25% goes to zero fare, and then at least 25% goes to the regional connectivity programs, and that would be 50% up to the discretion of the Commonwealth Transportation Board. That has been passed by both houses. Senate Bill 342 by Senator Barker up in Northern Virginia is a little bit different. He sets a 25% floor for reduced or zero fare projects. His bill does not have any language in there setting a floor for the regional connectivity program. So in theory, under Senator Barker's bill, all 100% of the program could go to zero fare. His bill has also been passed. So two bills have been passed by the General Assembly. They are different, and those differences are going to have to be worked out by the governor when he signs them. And one last thing about the Transit Ridership Incentive Program. The Senate's version of the budget set aside $10 million in general funds to TRIP to support long-distance commuter route service. Last year's budget set aside an additional $10 million for zero fare. Senator Barker, in his remarks, said it's only fair that zero fare got $10 million last year. He feels that the long-distance bus service should get $10 million this year. The House version of the budget contains no additional funding, so that difference is still to be determined how that works out. What are you ready to
No, I was going to say, for the regional routes, we've only received through two, and Lauren Magnato, who's sitting behind Mr. Dyke, actually manages this program for us. She's done a wonderful job building it from scratch. But we only had 3 applications in the first round for regional routes, and we only have 1 in the FY23 application cycle. So, I mean, given what's happening with regional commuting right now, that makes sense. But there is a significant amount of money out of that 6% of the mass transit fund that is available to support regional routes when we do get those applications. So we have funding. But can I get a quick?
Can I make a point, right?
Absolutely.
And this goes back to the brief discussion you had about today being a cutoff for the position. One of the things I'm seeing in some other areas we're working in is that there are a number of jurisdictions that don't have the, shall we say, the person power to do a lot of things that we can do, for example, in Northern Virginia and some other parts of the Commonwealth. Are we going to see throughout our plans some effort made to try to provide some assistance to them as we go through this, especially given the fact that there's this sort of shift in transit use and funding and trying to be post-COVID and everything else? And so I think we really ought to make an effort to make sure that those jurisdictions don't have those resources, that the state's in a position to help go in and support them going forward. Is that something we'll be?
Absolutely. We actually yesterday we sent out an email blast to all of our partners, in particular about the bus and bus facilities and the low-no, because Federal Transit Administration issued a notice of funding opportunity end of last week, first part of this week. Everything's a little run together. So we sent out notice to all of our partners to say we're here to help. And so we've asked folks that if they've got projects and they've got ideas and they want to apply, we can provide technical assistance and support them in the development of those applications, either through our transit staff and hopefully with a grant writer on staff as well. We've also, at the request of the Secretary, put together, using the transit development plans, transit strategic plans, and the 5-year capital budgets of all our transit agencies, we've put together basically a list of target projects. These are the projects that are out there that agencies are intending to pursue over the next 5 years that are eligible for this kind of funding. Obviously, there's some agencies that don't accept federal, we'll take those off the list, but we've kind of got a target list. Folks like Northern Virginia have that well under control, but we will be reaching out specifically to the small urbans and the rural that have projects on that list to say, what can we do to support you in pursuing this federal money? So definitely at the top of our list and a priority for this administration.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Andy? Andy's like, I'm glad I'm done.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to jump into the work plan. And this is just my first take on what I think this year looks like for us as a group. So just to kind of set the stage, the CTV policy requires that we get together. A code requires that we meet once a year. CTV policy requires that we meet once a year and do an annual review of the outcomes of the 6-year program process. So that's what we've done for the last couple of years. We've gotten together, we've told you we got this many applications, here's how things shook out in terms of funding, and how the merit process that this body helped institute has come together and how it's worked. So that's the language that's in the CTV policy. So our original work out of this committee, it seems like it wasn't that long ago, but it really was October of 2018. I know, October of 2018 that we finished the capital. It was a little bit later than that for the operating formula and for the transit strategic plan guidance. So that policy has now been used for the FY 20, 21, and 22 prioritization efforts. Last year when we got together, we were like, okay, we've done this for 3 years. This is the point at which we would start to talk about what do we want to do in terms of improvements. And I think we all agreed at that time, as we were looking at each other through Zoom, that wasn't the best time to do that because we weren't able to meet in person, and there were so many impacts to the transit industry that we wanted to delay it until things got better. And so we are there now, I hope. So we've gone ahead, fiscal year 23, that prioritization process is underway. We're using the existing CTV policy, so that'll be the 4th year of implementation. The process has worked the way we set it out. We're funding the things that I think we all think have discussed before are the most important. And I think you'll see in the recommendations that we're making this year that we've continued to pivot, and I will just leave it at that. Next month, we'll tell you what we've recommended, but we're still working, but we've kind of made some recommendations internally to get us to where we think we need to go. So as a group, we have 3 things that we really need to review over the next year. We need to review the capital prioritization and the CTV policy that's associated with that. We need to review the operating formula and the policy that's associated with that. And we also need to take a look at the transit strategic plan guidance. So most of our programs and our guidance, particularly on the planning side, don't go through CTV policy. But this particular one was part of that merit reform package, and the code actually says the CTV has to approve the guidance. So we did the pilots, which were HRT and GLTC when Brian was in Lynchburg. We've learned some things from the pilots. We also want to revise those strategic plan guidelines to reflect changes and things that we've learned through COVID. So those also will have to go back to the CTV, not as heavy a lift for this group, but we will also be bringing those to you. In terms of what will inform kind of the discussions and the recommendations that we bring to you, obviously we've got a whole litany of lessons learned. I mean, while we come to you with a package each year, as a team, we really dissected how things have worked and not worked, and what we see as opportunities to improve the program. So we've got a pretty good library of things that we've developed in-house and things that we've learned over 3 years in those annual TSDAC discussions. And we have the 2 studies that we're going to present today, because those also inform and have recommendations for us as well. So as I started pulling stuff together for today, I went back to the presentations that we've had the last 3 years to say, well, we've actually talked about things a lot already. And so on the capital side, and I'm sure that Sam and Jamie and Brian know this, most folks don't know this, we've had real technology challenges. The struggle has been real the last few months with Olga, which is our online grants administration system. We keep joking that the old girl is down but not out. So we're hoping that she's going to come back online this week. So we've kind of tried to shove a square peg into a round hole with Merit and Olga over the past few years. Like, our technology hasn't kept up with how the program has evolved and how we manage the program. So we've made some changes to make that smoother, but I will tell you, we did everything manually this year with fillable PDFs, and it went way smoother than Olga. And I am completely befuddled by that, because we're all sitting back going, how did we get done early when we're usually down to the wire? And so I think that says a lot about how our technology supports our agency partners and supports what we do. So while we've made some refinements to Olga, we have some other things in the hopper. We're going to be working on a new state-of-the-art type system over the next year or so. Not ready for the next cycle, but hopefully the one after that we'll be able to really meet where we are with the program.
If I could just ask, it is kind of somewhat of a technical question, Olga.
Yeah.
We obviously use Olga a lot to be looking at the data that transit systems are putting in, and we feel that we haven't been able to pull out a lot of the ridership and all that kind of stuff. Is that something that's going to be up online soon?
So what happens is, with Olga down, that means none of those systems have put in their data. So once Olga comes back online, we're going to be asking people to go back and catch up that data.
Because we want to be able to tell the ridership story, but
yeah. The struggle has been real, but the interesting part, I talked to Brian Smith yesterday. We're all missing Dr. Smith today. He's moved on from TSDAC, but I said, when HRT goes in and looks at their operating application and it says who put their operating application in the system, don't be surprised when it has my name. We actually put everybody's applications into the system. So we learned a lot about the side of the system that we don't normally see. That's going to help us be better going forward. So while we have talked about having better technology, we will have better technology and be able to have a system that incorporates that all together. So we can talk about that as well through the course of the year. Yes.
And I don't have enough technology background to answer this, I'm asking. But I'm hearing in some other agencies that there's technology problems, and a lot of them can be traced back to VITA and what's going on there. Does your problem have any connection with that at all?
No, it does not.
Okay.
So other recommendations that we've made as part of our annual reviews, we've talked about going back and revisiting state of good repair. If you'll remember, we had this big state of good repair backlog when we got started. And so we kind of pegged our points at assets being pretty much at their useful life to get that top score and get funded. And we talked about 3 or 4 years ago, we talked about how we need to start making those scores line up so that those assets are funded and then they arrive when that asset gets to its useful life. So really being able to back it up so that folks like Brian and Jamie and Sam are applying for assets maybe 2 years before they really need to be replaced so that that asset arrives when it needs to be replaced. So that's one of the things that we want to talk about. That's the next bullet as well. That just-in-time arrival, the replacement assets. If you'll recall, we used service impact and we used some factors. Basically, it ends up being a big lookup table to try to put a value on the impact that certain assets have on how service is provided, what the customer experience is like, safety, security. Those things are really not they're more qualitative than quantitative. I don't know that we have a good answer for that, but trying to figure out how to make that more quantitative over time is something that we've talked about as well. We continue to struggle with this $2 million line for major expansion projects it's a little bit arbitrary. We've had a few things that we've pushed through major expansion, like a data application for HRT last year, or year before last, that was like $3 million, but it really didn't fit anywhere in the program. So what that threshold looks like and what we really need to count as a major expansion project and how we push projects to that side of the program, which has a much more in-depth scoring process, is something we need to talk about. And then we touched on that HJ 542 study a couple of times already. On the operating side, and I think operating, I'll be honest, I feel like the capital, we're going to come to you next month with some really, some recommendations and a starting point. I think the operating will do the same, but operating is where I think it's just going to be harder to figure out how to unravel COVID and how it impacts our agencies. We've done a lot on the operating side to improve our performance data. We've built some checks into Olga so that our data is clean and it's verified. We validate every piece of data. I mean, I think you guys heard me 4 years ago talk a lot about this program's only going to be as good as the integrity of the data that we base things on, and we pride ourselves on that. We have caught some folks cheating. I mean, I'm just going to say we've caught people cheating, and we've made that right. So hopefully, data integrity is a big part of what we do. So we've worked on all of that. We've implemented a lot of checks and balances. As we improve our systems, I think we'll continue to make strides in that area. The struggle is going to be the impact of COVID on our performance metrics, because the impacts have been so broad and varying across the different systems. I don't want to put Sam on the spot, but GRTC, their local routes are above pre-pandemic levels. Other systems, I mean, you look at VRE, I mean, you can look at the commuter stuff in Northern Virginia, it's taken longer to come back, and until you see something change with the federal workforce, that's what you would expect to have happening up there right now. So we kind of followed FTA's lead and put everything on pause. So really, we're still working off the first set of performance data. We've continued to collect performance data and analyze it, but in terms of how it influences how the funds are allocated, everything has been on pause essentially from the first year that we implemented merit. So I've kind of been hoping that FTA would figure out how they were going to unravel it, and I think we're probably going to end up going before FTA. So we've got to kind of figure out how do we continue to have a performance-based formula, but do that in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact somebody. So how do we kind of unravel COVID as it pertains to performance metrics? We've heard a lot from the new administration about the importance of performance. So we do need to talk about performance and what's the right way to measure performance. I really do think that when it comes to the work that's ahead of TSDAC, this is the hard part, and one where there's not a real clear-cut solution. So laying all the cards on the table.
But it was that every time we've done this.
It is.
I mean, I'm not.
This is where it gets painful.
Yeah, every time.
Every time.
Always one of the losers, and that's.
Yeah. We will have scatter plots. We will be able to continue. We'll be able to show you scatter plots, but this is where things are going to get challenging.
So in terms of the impact of COVID, are we going to be potentially looking at the questions of where our thresholds are going to be because of increased costs of everything? And, you know, if we're thinking about minor projects versus major projects and, you know, the operating costs of systems and so forth, you know, obviously all of that is affected by labor shortages, by the cost of materials, the delay in implementation and so forth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I've already touched on both of these studies. I'm going to skip through this real quickly because these two gentlemen are going to give you deep dive on both studies, but those will inform us to try to make it a little bit easier administratively and a little bit easier for you to plan. We've tried. We're going to start out. I know April ends up falling on spring break for a lot of school systems, but we're going to try to stick to a kind of a standing monthly meeting schedule. Second Fridays, this was based on the poll that we did a couple months back. Ideally, we will wrap up by the end of the year. I think earlier would probably be a little bit better for all of us, but we want to make sure that we do our due diligence and we work our way through this. In terms of critical path, I mean, I think the way our process works is we open our grant application cycle on December 1st. So if we work back from that, particularly for capital, we would need to have any changes in terms of our capital application process done and approved by the board before we open that application cycle. So if you work back from that, board does not meet in November, so that means workshop in September, action in October, especially for capital. If you'll remember, in 2018, we did capital first, and we got that done in October, and I think we did operating in like January, February. That puts a little burden on our transit agency friends when they're working on budgets to be kind of later with the operating piece in terms of how we're going to distribute funds. But I think it's going to depend on how long it takes us to work through things. So we can work through it, and right now I will kind of looking ahead. What we've sketched out is a couple months ahead, and it's really going to depend on like how this group, like what we get into as we roll up our sleeves, and what we're looking ahead to do is in April come back, tell you what happened with FY23 and how the process worked, and things have gone pretty well. So I think that will be pretty straightforward in April, but we're going to bring you a slate of recommendations from the staff perspective for capital in April. We're already working on that, and we'll do a work session, roll up your sleeves with the TSDAC. We are doing the support for this in-house this time. So you are going to see DRPT staff, all the calculations and the work that's going to go on behind the scenes. So we're going to be able to respond, I think, a little more real time with TSDAC than we did last time. In May, and she snuck in since we got started, we have our sitting over there behind Cindy is Tanya Darasol. She's our new CFO. So putting her on the spot in May, she's going to come and talk to you about the FY23 budget and kind of what the look ahead looks like. So we'll do that, and then we'll do another work session on capital in May, and we'll bring you recommendations from DRPT staff for operating.
Public comment, all those sorts of things. How does that play into here? When is the right time? Inevitably, we'll have folks wanting to do public comment in this time frame. What's the target month for that?
So in terms of public comment, we have a public comment period in every meeting. So
but strategically, what is helpful? Yeah.
Strategically, I think, since we're going to lay out I think after we lay out recommendations, the next meeting is a good point for public comment. When we get to the point where we have a recommendation to the CTV, that will go out for a formal 45-day public comment period until the board takes action.
And Chair, if I could,
I was thinking about the work plan and the schedule, and hearing you talk about the complexities of operating and, you know, one, cost labor, but two, the data and the ridership and how to score it proactively with funky data in there. It kind of reminds me of the pension plan administrator for the city. I end up with this sort of 5-year smoothing as our investments do this, and so I'm like translating. I really feel like, especially when you're talking about getting to the CTV and stuff, I like this layout because it has capital first, but I really want to maybe recommend we really try to roll up our sleeves, solve capital, get it off the table so we can really totally focus on operating and try not to wait. I am hopeful that that's where we're going to end up. I think next month will really tell, like when you see what we bring you in terms of recommendations, I think that'll be a good judge of how quickly, that would be my preference as well. Because I do think operating is where we're going to get bogged down. Yeah. And I know my brain cells, I don't want to be toggling between capital and operating. I'm really hopeful that we can take capital kind of off the table this spring.
And likewise, one of the things that I know, because you guys are staffing in-house, when we get materials, we can actually digest and have a conversation here versus a briefing here, right?
So my team will tell you that they've already got a schedule based on when the meeting dates are, so you will get meeting dates the Friday prior, or meeting materials the Friday prior, like you did for this meeting.
Right, because of course all of us represent organizations, so we want to make sure that we get the smartest input.
You're all here to represent a lot more than the people.
Right, and so we want to be helpful. Yeah. Exactly.
And being able to control that in-house a little bit more helps us get you that. And I would say week before is great, and since I do council packets, I know how hard it is to do it earlier than your deadline, but when you can, I just think about me trying to reach out to VML. It's one thing to hit Mitchell Smiley, but we're also trying to get the rest of the localities. So we will do the best we can to get it out to you. I appreciate it. But yeah, that's just an ask, but not an expectation, but the week before is very helpful. Yeah, I think last go around we were getting you stuff a day or so before, so our target is the week before. But you can see capital I kind of didn't mention in June. I'm kind of thinking, Cindy, like you mentioned, that we're going to be able to, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to knock that out pretty early, because I do think. So, and maybe we can adjust in April, but when we do public documentations, right now capital shows as a work session, not as action. So I want to make sure we're messaging out when we think TSDAC's actually going to take action too. Right. And I mean, last time we worked towards consensus more than a formal action, and so we can work that out as we, or approve or something. It's just, I know if I see work session, you're thinking expecting TSDAC to have the recommendation. And I would think if we end up with 2 capital work sessions, we would not be at a point where you guys would be ready to sign off on it until we had another come back to close that out, so that you would have that time to consult with other parties. So that's kind of what it looks like. I've slotted transit strategic plans in there. I don't think we as a body spent a whole lot of time talking about transit strategic plans last time. I think with that, I mean, that strategic plan guidance was structured a lot off of the experience here in Richmond with a redesign and some of the things that had been learned around that point in time in 2018. I think the world's changed a lot since then, and so some of the points that we need to make in that strategic plan guidance are going to need to shift along with that. So we'll bring you recommendations for that as well. But I don't think that's a heavy lift for this body. I really do think the lift is operating. Sure. You were talking like timeline for capital applications operating. What's sort of the strategic important date for a strategic plan? I mean, like, we need to do it now and get it off the table, or? So the original legislation requires that the CTV adopt a 5-year implementation schedule for the transit strategic plan. So 5 years would have meant that everybody would have been done next year. Yeah. We've had budget language in the last biennial budget that put that on pause because of the impacts of COVID. I think that has come out of the next biennial budget. I think we said pull it out of there. And a lot of the transit agencies have moved forward. So I think we are we're in a place where, you know, that we need to get that schedule kind of back online, and we can reset that when we take our revision to the policy, to the CTV.
So what I'm kind of thinking, of course, strategic plan should be driving our transit operators' capital and operating. So what would happen if we move that up earlier? It does delay the operating a little bit, or we start small chunks of operating, so it starts evolving, but we try to get capital done and strategic done, and our focus is on. And I don't know if that's helpful or not to the RPT and the transit operators.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we determined when we talked internally was basically all of the transit agencies that need to have a transit strategic plan have to have one passed by their boards by June of 2024.
Okay.
So we do have some time. Typically, it takes year to year and a half to complete a plan. You also have to put the funding in place to even get started. I mean, in my mind, I would recommend, you know, sticking with this schedule, and that the strategic plan stuff can probably come towards the end, just because the capital and operating conversations are priority. That's just.
It's about money.
That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to know.
And yeah, in the larger systems, HRT, GRTC kind of started off ahead of everybody, and they've got some unique planning requirements related to CBTA that kind of mix in with this transit strategic plan stuff. The big agencies, Fairfax County is almost done, DASH is almost done. I mean, a lot of the big agencies have already, PRTC, I mean, what we have already kind of done, the ones that are left can finish it up in that time frame if we take that later.
Okay, because I wouldn't want them to start if we make major changes, but I don't know what your recommendations would be to the guidance. There's going to be.
I think some of it is.
Well, I was just going to say there's also an argument of delaying the strategic plans just as COVID starts to phase out. I know a lot of agencies, when we've talked to them, have been a little reluctant to get started because they wanted to see, you know, how things are shaking out. So.
But then there are others that are seeing the success of agencies like DASH, who have decided that this is now the time to, you know, to do a redesign and to do a new strategic plan and to implement some change in services that have worked out very well for them. So, point counterpoint right here.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think we're probably okay with slotting that in later. But I also think it depends on staff and having that recommendation ready to come back to you.
And so if I could maybe just suggest for April, we revisit that, because if operating is a priority, then I wouldn't want to sidetrack us in June, for example, and would we want to delay it or get it off the table? So just want to throw that out for thought. It's trying to run all three of these unless capital is done. I think it's just harder for us to absorb and give you informed reaction.
Okay. All right. I think that is my last slide. Any other questions about kind of what lies ahead? I will say on operating, we do need to have Olga come back online, to Kate's earlier point. We need the data that we can't get out of Olga right now before we can really dig into operating.
The strategic may come.
So strategic may end up having to come beforehand if we are lacking that data set. But fingers crossed, I think.
If it's possible, it might be worthwhile just to have a small section of one of those next meetings in April or May, just to focus a little bit on maybe one of the strategic planning processes, just to kind of tee it up for later consideration.
That's a great suggestion. We can definitely do that. All right. Well, that's enough questions.
Okay.
I'm going to turn it over to Mark Griffin from Taylor. You can have either. You're going to take Andy's seat. I'm pretty sure Andy's going to order a podium before our next meeting. So you should be able, Mark, to advance your own slides.
after Sarah from last year, JLAC were always very, their speaking text. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Mark from JLAC, and
Mark from Joe.
this morning I'm doing some of the findings from the 2021 transportation study. Before I get into that, I would add that the folks in this room have forgotten more about transportation and especially transit than I will ever know. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. I may have to turn some of those over to. A little bit about us. JLAC is a small legislative branch agency that reports to the Commission of Elected Members of the General Assembly. Our job is to do studies of state policies and agencies and make recommendations to the legislature. We do a couple of studies every year, and while our topics are selected by the legislature, our work is objective, nonpartisan, and research-based. Our work is also presented publicly, and our final reports are published on our website. We carried out a number of different research activities in our study, and those are this is our study mandate. We studied transportation infrastructure and funding back in November of 2020. Our study extended to a number of areas that I won't get into these days, such as those conditions, main funding. If you really want to know, we do have that report out there for you. We also touched on recent changes to rail funding. That was also new, but we didn't really have much useful there. The research activities, we carried out a number of research activities. Special interest to you, we interviewed several transit agencies of different sizes and did several analyses of ERPT data. I'm glad Olga was still functioning. In brief, here are some of our key findings. First, looking at transportation as a whole, legislative changes from the 2020 session and prior years have increased transportation revenues and will help address near and longer term funding concerns. We also found the state's intermodal planning process effectively examines long-term trends and identifies the most major transportation needs. Looking at transit in particular, we have some more concerning findings. Namely, Virginia transit agencies may not have enough funds to keep pace with capital needs. Many agencies may need to reduce services if ridership does not recover to pre-pandemic levels. A big caveat there is that this was all before, our analysis was all before the state's revenue projection came out in December, before the current budget got put together, and perhaps more importantly, before all this federal money, before we knew how much federal money was going to be coming into the system. So that could affect a little bit that outlook. We also found that changes are needed to the merit funding programs to better account for services and investments that improve transit access. Skipping along for a little background, not news to anyone here, but Virginia has a multimodal transportation system. This, of course, includes the road networks, but also transit, freight and passenger rail, sidewalks, trails, bike lanes, pedestrian crossings, etc. Commonwealth transportation budget was $8.1 billion in fiscal 22. The majority of budget spending was in two areas. The biggest one being road maintenance and operations, and the second one being multimodal improvements. Transit and rail funding is the next biggest category, followed by regional funding. Most of that regional funding goes towards road improvements, but there are substantial pieces in there for transit.
Quick question, that's all sources of funding? Or is that just state?
That's everything that flows through the state budget.
Okay.
So there are some local funds in there, but most local funds are not.
It also includes federal money.
Federal money that goes through the state is in there, but if it's federal money that goes straight to agencies, then that will not be captured in the budget. I think
Okay.
two people who might be able to.
That's fine. That's fine.
The state-managed transportation funds are distributed through a number of programs in each of the funding areas, largely determined by percentages and formula set in code. Funding distribution is fairly complicated, so what we presented here is a very overly simplified version how it all works. We've seen even a less simple versions that are still complicated. The simple you can get it.
Job.
This slide here is just to show that there are many players in creating the multimodal transportation system, including at the state, local, and regional levels. Government agencies, of course, also work with several other public and private partners, such as toll road operators, Amtrak, and railroads. With that out of the way, the first topic I want to cover with you is transportation revenue. Virginia gets its transportation revenues from several state and other sources. As you can see on the top bar, the state is projected to get $4.2 billion in revenue from state taxes and fees. The big three here are the state sales tax, the motor fuel tax, and the vehicle sales tax. The rest of transportation dollars come from a mix of federal funding, state authorized regional taxes, local contribution bonds, and various other sources. And again, this does not capture many, if not most, we found that recent legislative changes made in the past few years have increased transportation revenues and helped address funding concerns, at least at the state level. Prior to 2020, the needs of Virginia's transportation system were projected to outpace revenue. On the maintenance side, reviews carried out by state transportation agencies, including PRPT and VDOT, found that maintenance needs are going to exceed allocated funds by around $300 million per year. On the improvement side, the amount of money awarded to transportation projects under SMART Scale, which is a major multimodal funding program, that money has declined by $160 million in the most recent round. Finally, fuel tax revenues were flat and projected to decline over the long term. These near and long-term revenue concerns in mind, the 2020 General Assembly passed legislation that increased and expanded fuel taxes, indexed those taxes to inflation, and created new highway user fees, among several other changes. The 2020 changes appear to have effectively addressed gaps in the road maintenance budget and reversed the decline in funding for multimodal projects. These changes built on several other changes that the General Assembly has made in the past decade. For example, there was a big increase in truck fuel taxes between 2019. One of the most recent changes, state revenue allocations are projected to increase by $3.6 billion over a 6-year period. In addition to the added state revenues, there are also millions in new regional tax revenues. We mentioned CTV earlier. So there is another graphic hiding under this one. So the first graphic that you can't see basically shows what's going to happen with fuel consumption over the next couple of years. So the federal projections are showing that over the next 10 years, there'll be a 3 to 18% decline in fuel consumption from pre-pandemic levels. So fuel consumption, the story is just steadily going down. Although that is likely to happen, the state's recent changes should offset any lost revenues from fuel tax. You can see here the combination of tax increases and inflation indexing is likely to boost revenues in the near term and keep them from declining at least over the next 10 years. This is a really big deal, and this one of the main reasons why this legislation was passed in 2020 was this concern that we were going to start losing money from that major revenue source, which is 1/3 of the state revenue for transportation. Another caveat here is our projections do not account for any of the potential tax cuts or proposed suspension of fuel tax as currently under consideration.
Thank you for clarifying that for the public record.
The other major 2020 change worth mentioning was the creation of 2 new user fees. I won't get into these in detail, but the upshot is these fees are not dependent on fuel consumption, and one day they could capture enough revenue to replace lost fuel. Another broad topic we looked at is how the state plans for and funds multimodal improvements. Virginia's transportation system is in pretty good condition, but still has its problems. There's chronic congestion on major interstates like I-95, 64, areas like Northern Virginia and Hampton roads. There are also safety issues on urban and rural roads throughout the state. Addressing these problems requires continued planning, investment, and system improvement. We found the state's planning process, which is called VTrans, effectively identifies long-term trends and most major transportation needs. VTrans has identified and grouped the long-term trends into the 4 categories that you see up here. For example, technological advancements includes trends such as growth in electric and autonomous vehicles. The trends that identified in VTrans are the same ones that we found doing our own research, and also the state is already taking action to address many of these concerns. For example, on the technological front, there's a lot of effort going in to expand the number of charging stations available for EV vehicles. Looking at needs, the state is effectively identifying most of its major needs under VTrans. It does that by making extensive use of data, stakeholder outreach. Importantly, especially from the y'all's perspective, VTrans does take a multimodal approach. So while it does identify problems associated with specific modes like road congestion, it also looks for problems like issues with transit access. More importantly, it doesn't look at modal solutions. The door is left open for different ways of solving problems, such as reducing road congestion through expanded transit, or instead of pursuing construction projects. When it comes to the solution side, the state's largest improvement program is called SmartScale. SmartScale is an objective and apolitical way for distributing project funds. It's also a multimodal program so it can fund any type of improvement project. We found that SmartScale scores potential projects using clear criteria and objective measures, and that the outcomes appear to be fair and equitable across Virginia's many regions. For example, the amount of project funding each region gets is generally proportional to its size. One of the criticisms that we heard about the program was that it only funds smaller projects, but the data indicated that it does in fact fund a variety of projects of different sizes. The SmartScale scoring system is designed in a way that actually encourages and rewards projects that include transit and bike pedestrian elements. Projects that are focused entirely on these areas typically do pretty well. And the scoring also encourages road projects that might not otherwise include those elements to actually incorporate them. Even so, in the last round of SmartScale, there were relatively few projects that were directly submitted by transit agencies. So in the last round, only 3 transit agencies directly submitted any projects. Some folks may have submitted through localities, I can't be sure of that. But in terms of direct projects from transit agencies, only 3 folks did that. But of the 10 projects that those agencies did submit, 6 received funding, and that is actually a very impressive batting average for SmartScale to get 6 out of 10. So there may be some opportunities for transit agencies to pick up more funding in SmartScale in future years. The downside is that you have to wait a very long time to get your SmartScale money. So from the time you put together your application to when the money actually appears in the bank account, that can be 7 to 8 months.
Except for selling back the budget and do contingency in there.
Except for this cycle, right?
Right. So the SmartScale round 5 just opened up. I guess it was last week. And we heard that I think it's just specific to round 5. The funding will be available 2 years sooner than we had anticipated it. So they're moving up the funding flow years, I guess.
Something we've been advocating for.
This last section here, we'll look at transit issues specifically. Then you'll notice, again, I do. There are 40 public transit agencies in the state. Largest, of course, being Metro of Northern Virginia. Of course, we have transit all across the state, urban and rural areas, and transit is a critical piece of the state's transportation structure. State assistance is a significant source of revenue for transit agencies. Again, I feel like you told me all this. The state is providing $758 million in transit in fiscal 22. high because of the bump in state money that year, but as you know, state money is pretty important. And of course, state funding for all transit agencies not in metro flows through the two merit programs. The state recently increased the funding provided to transit agencies. Metro funding was boosted by $160 million per year in 2018, and merit funding for other transit agencies increased by about $35 million per year in 2020. This table I attempted to show that trend over time. So on the operating road, the modest increase there is pretty clear. On average, the annual operating funding is expected by about $5 million per year based on what it used to be. The capital trend is a lot harder to see, so I probably shouldn't even put that up there. Two of those base years are really lumpy with some extra carryover and other money, so you can't really see how much it went up. But if you take what is projected in the out years here and compare that to what had been projected before, it's actually an increase of about $30 million per year, or about 72% of what was going to be in there if the 2020 changes had not gone into effect. Not shown here, but also mentioned earlier, the 2020 legislation also created a TRIP program. TRIP is also slated to provide, as you moved it up projections, about $20 million more per year towards zero fare and access initiative. Our first finding in this area is that the transit agencies have sufficient operating funds in the near term, but will face challenges if ridership and fare revenues don't return to pre-pandemic levels. On aggregate, fare revenues have declined 57% from pre-pandemic levels. That drop was mostly due, of course, to lost ridership, although some transit agencies have also reduced their rate fees. The other thing you can see in this table is that federal revenues went up substantially, which has helped agencies backfill some of those lost fare revenues. A lost fare revenue could lead to permanent service reductions at some agencies. Across the state, fare losses were equal to about an 11% reduction in operating revenue, with a cash value of $56 million, which is a pretty big hit. Of course, not everyone has been impacted equally. Some smaller agencies only lost a few $1,000 and should be able to plug those gaps. But for others, I think Virginia Railway Express was mentioned earlier, the loss actually creates a pretty substantial multi-million-dollar gap. As I mentioned a minute ago, so far agencies have been able to use those federal pandemic relief funds to cover losses, but many could face operating cuts when those funds run out, unless, of course, ridership recovers. So you all know this, again, better than I do, but it looks like some agencies will not fully recover their pre-pandemic ridership anytime soon. The merit program will need to account for long-term changes in ridership, but it also needs to avoid making any drastic or harmful cuts to agency funding. As you'll recall, merit operating funds are distributed by a formula that relies on ridership as part of its base calculation. Some agencies have experienced much greater ridership losses than others, and some have recovered ridership better than others. Some of those changes are probably long-term changes, which means some agencies may need to rescale their services. The state should not be in the business of subsidizing some agencies at the expense of others, but of course the state shouldn't be reducing funding in a way that further harms already struggling agencies. So as Jim was pointing out earlier, this is sort of the task that you guys have ahead of you as you go and look at the merit operating formula. We considered making some potential recommendations on how to change merit to address that, but given all the uncertainties, especially at the time that we were finishing our report, we thought it would be wiser to point to you all at the FCC. So we recommended that the FCC continue to monitor ridership recovery at transit agencies and work with you guys to develop options for changing the merit formula to account for these kinds of changes without severe drastic cuts. Our next finding was that the merit operating formula does not account for transit services that improve access. Improving access is one of the state transportation goals set by the CTV. improving access has also been a priority of the General Assembly, with the emphasis on access in recent legislation. And access is also a priority of the transit agencies that we interview. Even though access is a priority, the merit formula doesn't directly account for it. And I'll pause right there and point out that it's a lot easier for us to come in and, with the benefit of hindsight, act as armchair quarterbacks. I don't mean to disparage the work that you all have done, that DRPC has done in putting this together. In fact, I'm sure this is something that you would have come up with when you all did the course of your 3-year review. But just to walk you through it, merit calculates a base cost for each agency and then adjusts it up or down based on performance measures. The current performance measures consider efficiency and cost effectiveness, which closely follows what statute directs. However, transit agencies also operate low volume local services that can improve system access, especially in low income and other transit dependent areas. These routes are, of course, not necessarily efficient or terribly cost effective. So some of the agencies we talk to were concerned that the current funding formula penalizes them for offering these needed local services. So our recommendation was for DRPT to review the formula's performance measures, determine how they could be changed to better recognize or promote transit access. Next finding was on the capital side. We found that Virginia's public transit assets were generally in good condition, but the state contributions may not be enough to keep up with future capital needs. As we know, transit agencies maintain a variety of assets, from fleet vehicles to facilities, and agencies report asset condition to FDA. As you can see here, Virginia agency assets were generally in better shape than assets nationwide. Larger Tier 1 agencies did have a substantial number of non-fleet vehicles that were not in good repair. That was mostly driven by just 2 agencies. And even then, Virginia's number was still better than the national number. There were multiple Tier 2 agencies that lagged both the state and U.S. totals across a number of asset categories. Those are mostly agencies that serve a mix of urban and rural areas. The DRPT folks thought that some of the lag might have to do with the mix of assets that those agencies have, including transit vans and other vehicles with shorter lifespans that could potentially be used beyond their service life more readily than, say, a large bus. Although Virginia was in generally good shape, we still have a lot of stuff that needs to be replaced and fixed, which, of course, we talked about earlier. At the time that we did the math, there were 487 fleet vehicles in need of replacement, and that's not including Metro that everybody else. Our biggest concern with transit agencies or transit assets was that looking forward, state capital assistance may not be enough to meet future needs. Agencies, of course, need to regularly replace their fleet vehicles if they receive their useful lives. They also need to make changes to enhance services, such as adding new routes or switching to new fare box technology. So looking at DRPT's capital for fleet projections, we saw that there was a $52 million shortfall for asset replacement and $174 million for enhancements over the next 5 years. 2 notes there. First, those gaps would have been a lot bigger had the state not increased funding in 2020. So that was a big help in closing what would have been a larger gap. And second, those gaps here, they may shrink significantly based on the evolving revenue picture. Again, our report was done before the revenue forecast, before the current budget, and before we knew how much federal money was going to be flowing to Virginia. So that federal money alone, depending on how it can be used, could significantly shrink a lot of the budget gaps.
So along that line, in December, the CTV allocated $39.8 million out of the Priority Transportation Fund. So that's money outside of the transit program that enabled us to go back and look at the FY22 applications we had received. If you'll remember, we didn't get to go down the list as far as we normally would. So that $39.8 million enabled us to go back and fund the applications from FY22 for state of good repair and some minor enhancement down to where we would have recommended had we had the money available for fiscal 22. So we did that in December, and then to Mark's point, the revenue reforecast that came out in December, in January, the board adopted a revised budget and a revised 6-year program, which enabled us to provide some additional operating assistance, some significant additional operating assistance, and enabled us to advance a couple more capital projects that had been applied for in FY22 that we had not been able to fund. And one was a facility project with HRT, and the other one was the state match required for the CSPDC project in Stanton, where they had applied for the federal bus and bus facilities funding. So that, and then the additional money that we did not program for capital in FY22, we've carried over, and we'll use that in programming FY23. So not to get too far ahead of myself, but we are in a much better position going into a fiscal 23 6-year program than we were when we were talking to Mark and his colleagues last year.
Okay, one question or ask, maybe here when we do the April and you're bringing your recommendations, not that we have to do a deep dive, but is there a chart or a summary where you can, at least in our packet, tell us, okay, you saw this at SGR, and now we've reviewed here, just so we can kind of see how those two funding sources impacted it.
Sure. So we can,
for data point, not necessarily a discussion on.
We can show you, in fact, we can send that out to you before April, because it was an action that the board took back in January, how that additional funding looks based on the December forecast over the next 5 years, recognizing we will get another forecast before we finalize the 6-year program. So it really was coming off of a couple of years of very conservative revenue forecast due to COVID. What you saw in the December forecast was kind of some of that pent-up funding as revenues came in higher than had been projected. You kind of see that starting to flow through the program in 23 and 24. When you get to 25, I keep warning everybody, you get kind of this pent-up funding from a couple of years of very conservative forecasts that creates a little bit of a bubble in 22, 23. You get to 24, we go back to that kind of that trend line that we saw.
Like 5-year smoothing on
5-year smooth. I've been telling people, don't get so excited with what you saw in January, because it does level back out.
That's helpful just to put it in context with the J-Lark study, and then we can see how it scored down, and then as we're talking turkey on capital and operating funding, we can keep that in mind.
And again, I don't want to, but we haven't finished our work internally, and we haven't even preliminarily briefed the board, but you know, we have looked at some things with the capital list, particularly the state of good repair list, knowing that we have had no bus contract for a year, and there's this lag in delivery of the vehicles from manufacturers that we're looking at, can we go deeper in this state of good repair request this year based on the funding that we have available, so that we can try to get more of those vehicles in the pipeline for replacement than maybe we typically have over the past couple of years.
Yes, I really like that. Our long-term plan was to be better than just in time, but be proactively arrive on time.
We're in a much better place than we were 4 years ago.
I think the thing that dynamic we're all going to need to be mindful of is the impact of inflation and labor. I think
Fuel costs.
Right, and so what may have been, $1 million, $5 million request might not cover that now. So I mean, there's so many different factors that I'm also throwing in with the federal infrastructure bill, which is for a lot of the properties capital only. What does that look like? What does that play out? So thank you. You're going to be putting all these pieces together, because I think it's important to understand all of this stuff.
So I'll give you an example. In January and again in February, I had to go stand in front of the board to ask the board to approve transfers of funding, unallocated funding, to vans. I think it's primarily vans, but we've seen 15 and 20% increase in vehicle costs. Yeah. And so when you have to go back and look at like your 5310 human service program and say across the board, none of these agencies can afford the vehicles that have been funded. And they were funded at 100% under CRISA and ARPA and the federal relief funds that came and are really helping those agencies provide that critical transportation. So we've had to go back and supplement that. I think we're going to chase that for a while.
And on the operating side, labor contracts,
Fuel.
well, fuel, although hopefully you've had, anyway, but
We've been talking about fuel.
fuel, but the other part of it is for those systems that have labor contracts that have, as part of their arbitration, raises and things like that linked to inflation is not something that can be just unilaterally changed. It's just a thing. It's a real cost that's going to be borne by a lot of our transit agencies, depending on what happens with their arbitrated, their CBAs and they were negotiated. So, yeah. We have more money, but the cost may, I don't know. It's hard to see how we'll catch up with that, so.
And whether there's the inflation,
Yeah.
contract provision or not, the need to retain and attract
Well, and then
employees,
there's,
driving
exactly,
wages up.
yeah.
That's the work ahead of us. It's challenging.
As you know, we covered, we recommended putting the surplus revenues in capital budget. Last finding here was that the merit capital program could better account for passenger amenities and improve transit access. Larger transit agencies with fixed route services reported a need for more passenger amenities. Amenities like shelters and benches improve system access, they encourage use, and they show appreciation and respect for passengers. Amenities have a renewed importance as we emerge from the pandemic because they are one small improvement that can help lower that virus. Several transit agencies reported their system lacked amenities on many routes, and I reprinted one of the more memorable quotes to that effect here. The extent of the amenity problem is not clear, at least at the statewide level, but the new strategic planning requirements could shed some light on it. I'd also note that other access improvements are also needed, things like sidewalks and safe pedestrian crossings to get people to Moscow. But responsibility for those improvements lies with state and locality. One of the challenges for amenities is getting funding, and we found that many projects tend not to score well under the merit program. Jim can correct me, but I believe amenities typically fall into the minor enhancement bucket. So a simplified version of the minor enhancement criteria are shown here. You can see how amenity projects score well in some criteria and not others, which may explain why they tend not to do as well in this project. So again, we recommended that DRPT review the criteria to see if they could be changed to make amenity projects more competitive. Of course, we're not recommending a whole system be changed just so these projects work better. We recognize that there are other types of projects that might be just as or more important to transit agencies, but the recommendations really kind of look at holistically, does what we have make sense, and does it keep us from funding some projects that we actually do have. We being you.
The royal we.
That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to try and answer any additional questions, but again, I'm pretty sure you all know way more about this than I do.
It's always nice to have the legislative auditor come in and confirm a lot of what you're working on.
And we appreciate the fact that you've come to tell us what you told the legislature, which is perhaps not quite as deeply involved on a day-to-day basis with understanding some of these issues.
Definitely something we were very happy to hear, something that we can improve, and also we're concerned about there. It's never going to fix everything, but we're in a decent position.
Anybody have any questions?
Just wanted to make a comment. First of all, thank you so much, Mark. It's great to see this. And I am encouraged that assuming you've done a very similar presentation with our VDOT colleagues, in particular, what sort of resonated with me was talking about some of those improvements to stop sidewalks, pedestrian things. That is obviously in most of the Commonwealth, that is a VDOT responsibility. So any way that we can help them understand some of the challenges our transit systems have in doing those things, I think it's really good. I don't know if they heard any of that part of the conversation, because that might be helpful.
I'm not sure we, I definitely, we presented this, and then the findings also went to the CTV, Deputy Secretary here presentation. He did a better job. One of the things that we have in our report for today is we discussed the assembly or the money for the revenue sharing program, which is a money, essentially a match program where they pick up the money that can be used pretty quickly to transportation to fund, and a lot of localities use that to fund their sidewalk projects, sidewalk extension projects. Some money has been taken out of that as part of the budget cuts. And so one of our other recommendations was to basically come back and return that money. So hopefully that's a stream that can help pay for those sort of minor projects or smaller scale projects. That's not.
Great, thank you.
I can talk revenue sharing. Yeah, so some of this is like, okay, I'm here for transit, but Kate was reading my mind because the slide that talks about the sidewalks and crossing the rest of the state and localities, that's where small scale and revenue sharing needs to think about jointly with transit operators to coordinate with us for that leveraging of funding. Revenue sharing is one that was cut, but also pushed out. So when you're talking the 6 to 7 years, so fortunately we're moving up, still FY26, I think, but it's moving forward 2 years. I think that's where we need to really work together. So, for example, of course, I'm a WMATA bus system user, so they're excluded from a lot of this, but for today's discussion. But what we've been talking about is they're doing an ADA assessment and looking at their stops and what the issues are, because I'm doing a lot of streetscape, because I got Smart Scale, I got MBTA, 70% money. So if I'm out there, let's make sure we're doing it aligned with what the transit agency said. And one of the things that really resonated in a recent meeting is they thanked me for where we put the bus shelters, because they're far enough off the road so the mirrors aren't taken out and damaging the shelters, which then, of course, I'm going, yeah, you're covering it because I'm not doing it on my insurance. So it's that kind of stuff where I think that's coordinating. Now, that's a small thing, but, you know, General Assembly did a sidewalk study last year with guidance with VDOT. There's a lot of things that interplay. It's kind of hard to, when we're doing this for transit, remembering the other things. And so that's where I think
access. That is the access.
That is the access. And that is where, like, the strategic plan can help do that connection back to the locality or the state. Now, I happen to own and operate my road, so it's a little easier, but VDOT is the player in the Commonwealth for that.
So we'll pick up a lot of this in the next presentation. I'm sorry, Mr. Dyke.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a couple points that we're working on with VDOT. One is that their traffic engineering folks analyze a lot of data. They get all the crash data, and so they've picked up some trends in looking at pedestrian safety analysis at pedestrian incidents near bus stops. So they've identified that as a hot spot as part of their pedestrian safety plan that they're working on. So we're in dialogue with them on that. That hadn't happened before. So that is a positive, and that's coming from an old VDOT person. The other thing that we've worked on more recently is, you know, some of what we've heard through the equity modernization study is for the folks that operate transit on VDOT maintained roads, it can be a challenge to get a bus shelter, a pad through the approval process to get placed. Because we've always wondered, well, we fund them and it takes forever for them to get placed. So we actually had, it was Charlottesville Area Transit in Garland, and his crew and Albemarle County Board of Supervisors had reached out to us and reached out to VDOT. We kind of put our heads together and we started to see where there were some opportunities for us to maybe make things better. And so we've got a little working group that we've put together with VDOT, a couple folks from our office that work in, you know, our new engineer who came from VDOT and understands VDOT, speaks VDOT, and one of our planners who's worked a lot on the, you know, on the shelters and on the amenity side are going to be partnered up with a couple of folks at VDOT that are empowered to go in and make the process look better. And so it doesn't get to money and how you pay for this stuff, but we're trying to put the building blocks in place so it becomes part of the culture of the two organizations to work together and to solve problems instead of just kind of doing this thing back and forth between us, the localities, and VDOT and the transit agencies, really trying to figure out how we can solve those problems.
That sounds great. I think the issue of access can be the focal point, because it doesn't matter if we're talking VDOT, City of Falls Church, transit operator, it all comes together. And the VDOT study for roads are very interesting, because they've identified Route 7 as one of the primary pedestrian vehicle conflict areas. That was where we're trying to do BRT, exactly to their point, where I've got the BTPI $10 million grant that's looking for innovation technology. So I feel like that's music to my ears, Jen, because that's what we need to do. We need to cross-pollinate, and maybe, Jane, that's what you and I get to do for VACO and CML, is kind of bring the rest of the state perspective in, because we're doing the multiple funding sources and needs.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that theme, because I think it needs to be even broader, because given all the post-COVID realignment of what people do and what have you, that there's a housing component, a planning component here that needs to be factored into this. And so as we're making decisions about where we're putting housing and how we're addressing those issues, you got to tie that into access to transit and where people are going to be living. And so it really puts us in a position where the various agencies have to have a broader knowledge of what they're doing. They're not in a silo anymore. We've got to be in a position where we can factor in, if we're going to plan a community and work with a locality to put some housing there, that we need to make sure there's adequate transit connected to that, or there's access to it. And maybe that's what you're going to get to in your report. I'm not quite sure. But my point is, given the changing nature of how we're operating, we really got to have a little more comprehensive approach to our planning and recognize how all these things tie in together, as far as transit and housing and moving people to jobs, and how people doing more things remotely now is going to impact on this. It all is starting to come together now. And so the more knowledge we have about how what we do in our little sector impacts on another is very important.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, just really quick, if I may, when we're talking about access and grant, I'm just ready for your presentation. Whenever you're ready, I'm ready. But we are talking about access and sidewalks, et cetera. Most transit agencies are not DRTC, HRT, or WMATA. They don't have a Garland on staff that's a planner. So I would just say, be mindful of, all of this is very good, but if we're talking as a group for actual delivery of whatever it is, technical assistance is going to need to happen, because we're not going to be able to do it. You can tell Fredericksburg all day in Spotsylvania County and Stafford, but if you've got Jamie being the planner, the marketing person, the director, and actually now managing transportation for the city of Fredericksburg, the last thing I'm thinking about is putting in your sidewalk. So if somebody can help the Williamsburg area transit of the world do that, then if not, we're not advancing the needle. A manual is not going to help me. I need people.
And I can speak directly to Jamie's concerns about this area. I think the first professional experience I had with you after your graduation was to talk about getting a bus shelter put in front of one of our elementary schools, and it was a challenge.
And I will say that's something that we really have taken to heart, because we can push as much money through the program as we can get Mark to convince the legislature to give us, but it doesn't help if it comes to you and you're like, that's great, but I have no idea what to do with it next. And so, we've changed how we're structured. We've changed how we're staffed. I mean, on the transit side of the house, we have, Grant's planning team is much larger than they were when he got here a few years ago, because we need to help people with smart scale applications. We need to help folks with NEPA for bus shelters to get the federal money pinned down. We've applied for federal money and got federal grants for VDOT at this point for ferry boat discretionary. I mean, so we've kind of changed the way we do business so we can better support the agencies to implement what we're able to fund. We're not just here to fund, we're not just here to plan, we're here to partner with you to make it happen. Now the last few missing pieces of the puzzle, we now have, an engineering team, and they're, went down and spent the day with Zach and the crew over at WADA, like, how can we help you get through this construction project? You've never built a building before. So we can help you. Yes, you can hire a consultant, but, you know, if you need somebody to help you, we can help you with that too. And so we're really trying to line ourselves up to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is what y'all been doing and what we've actually seen. I mean, it's actually really good stuff, and I'm not saying that because you're here, because if it's not good, it's not good. But it's,
I know you'd tell me, and I would tell you about it.
Right. But it's been actually really, really good. I just think from our standpoint as a committee, just making sure that we're cognizant of anything that we tell everyone to deliver, that we actually also have the, that we reference what infrastructure is in place at DRPT, because if not, some agencies will say, well, what do you want me to do with this notebook? Or this policy, or this recommendation. So, yeah.
Especially as we add federal money to the game, even more federal money, that changes is a lot.
Okay.
One thing to Kate's original question, we talked about CDOT, but that local planning offices have really folks who are in charge of a lot of projects, like sidewalk projects. It kind of depends on where you are. So some places we have central office, some places we might have a PDC involved, but in a city or a larger locality like Chesterfield, we don't have a transportation planning office, and they're deciding where that side of the money, that house side of the money goes, whether it goes towards a road project, interchange improvement project, better pedestrian crossing, extending sidewalks. So it's really this multi-layer.
Any other questions or comments? Well, again, Mark, thank you very much for the presentation.
Your turn.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Grant Sparks. I'm the Director of Transit Planning for DRPT, and I'm also the Project Manager for the House Joint Resolution 542 Virginia Transit Equity and Modernization Study, which is an important initiative that DRPT has been working on since last summer. Similar to the JLARC study, some of the findings from this study may be relevant to our conversation over the next 4 to 5 months and could advise some changes to the merit programs. I guess I'll also say that I do recognize that some of you in the room have been involved in the study. So the very first part of this presentation, I'm going to just provide an overview of the study, the timeline, and our progress to date. And then the second half of the presentation, I'm actually going to dive into some of the findings and the ones specifically that are relevant to this group. So to start us off, how did we get here? Last year, House Joint Resolution 542 passed in the General Assembly with strong support from transit stakeholders. The resolution specifically requires DRPT to explore a wide variety of topics that will create recommendations for advancing transit equity and modernization efforts. This legislation called out 6 topics in particular that need to be looked at by the DRPT team. Those include transit accessibility, the adequacy of transit infrastructure, emerging technologies in transit, transit electrification, transit safety, and transit system engagement and governance. And then there's also some language in HJ 542 which suggests that DRPT must place an emphasis on engagement opportunities for underrepresented communities. So at the onset of the study, we had to establish some high-level study goals. First and foremost, we wanted to identify transit agency, rider, and stakeholder needs. And then to address those needs, we also wanted to put together a comprehensive action plan, which includes specific strategies, a timeline for implementation, as well as calling out the responsible agencies for implementing the action plan. And last but certainly not least, we also wanted to define underrepresented and underserved communities. So really understand where these communities are and also what their role is in the transit decision-making process throughout the country. So the objectives within those 6 topic areas that I mentioned. We wanted to first, I guess within the accessibility topic, do a supply versus demand type of accessibility gap analysis, just to understand where the gaps in transit service are throughout the Commonwealth. We also wanted to better understand the needs and barriers to improve transit infrastructure. So not just the buses and the facilities themselves, but also the bus stops and the journey to the bus stops. We wanted to look for opportunities to reduce the carbon footprint through bus electrification. We did have to figure out early on whether or not this is going to be zero emission type study or more bus electrification. This is bus electrification, so this does not include hydrogen fuel cell technologies and some of those other types of zero emission technologies. We also wanted to identify strategies to inform the implementation of more emerging technologies in transit. We wanted to look for opportunities that enhance passenger and transit employee safety. And then last but not least, we also wanted to develop a framework for identifying and engaging disadvantaged populations and underserved communities. So in terms of the timeline of the study, we launched this thing back last July, and we broke it into 3 phases. We spent a good portion of the summer doing a data collection phase, where we reviewed as many plans, GIS data, performance data, policies, whatever we could get our hands on. We tried to review it. And then we moved on to phase 2, which was our baseline conditions phase, and spent the fall and the early winter working on that. Highlighted in red there was our first major deliverable, which was actually called out in House Joint Resolution 542. We submitted an interim study report to the General Assembly in December. And then as we moved into the new year, we shifted to action planning, and we've been working on developing our action plan over the last couple months. And we will be transitioning to developing our final report here in the next month or 2. And the second and final deliverable is the final study report, which is due to the General Assembly in August. So just to give everybody an update on what we've already done, some of the activities that are ongoing, as well as some activities that are upcoming. I mentioned that we completed the data collection phase and we reviewed plans, policies, and data. We also launched the study website, and I'll share that domain with you here in a second. But all of our study materials are posted on the study website. At the very beginning of the study, we also developed a transit agency survey. This is a pretty comprehensive survey touching on the 6 topic areas, and we distributed to all of our transit agencies in Virginia. We received a 100% response rate, so we got everybody to weigh in, and that served as a kind of a jump-off point for us to really understand what the transit agency's needs were. We also conducted a series of transit rider focus groups. We had 7 groups, and we had a really good, diverse set of transit riders throughout the Commonwealth who participated in these groups. We had frequent riders from across the Commonwealth. We had the occasional rider, those who don't always use transit but do from time to time. We had a paratransit, a complimentary paratransit rider focus group, and we also had a commuter focus group. And then I think we also had some individuals who represent a rider advisory council join us for those focus groups.
Hey, Grant, can you tell the group a little bit about the technology that the consultant team used for those? Because I sat in on a couple of them, and it was educational and it was fascinating. So I think it's worth mentioning how they were conducted.
Yeah. So first of all, they were pretty long. I think they were 3 to 4 hours maybe that we asked volunteers to sit in on these focus group meetings. And the DRPT team actually, the technology that was used kind of acted as a two-way mirror, where the DRPT team could kind of sit behind the scenes and just observe the conversations that were being facilitated by our consultants. And I mean, we had never had an experience like that before at the state level, we don't have direct communication and dialogue with our transit riders in Virginia. This way, we actually got to talk to them, kind of. We did have this chat platform with the moderator of those focus groups, where if we wanted to, prod our riders to go a little bit further into into what their comments were, we could easily just type questions or comments to the moderator. So it was a great experience doing these rider focus groups, and I think certainly we can use that technology again in the future.
Grant, how were those riders recruited for the focus groups?
We tried to rely. It was hard to recruit. To be honest, I know transit agencies, at the local level, have a hard time sometimes getting riders for state focus groups. So at the state level, it was a big challenge. We did rely on our partners to kind of help get the word out that we were recruiting. Specifically, we reached out to as many rider advisory councils and committees as we could in Virginia. I think we found actually through this study that 30% of our transit agencies have a rider advisory council, and so we could use them to kind of get the word out that we were soliciting participation. But we personally, again, because we don't have direct communication with the transit rider, it was hard for us to recruit ourselves. And we did provide an incentive. We gave them a gift card with participation, which certainly helped. Just the last two bullets on this completed list, we prepared a pretty comprehensive baseline conditions assessment. This is probably the most technical document that we've developed as part of this study. It's about 250 pages and kind of summarizes all of our outreach efforts, the data that we reviewed, the transit agency survey results, focus group takeaways, and pretty much everything that we did up until when we submitted it in the late fall. And then there's also the interim study report, which I mentioned earlier on, which was submitted to the General Assembly in September. In terms of ongoing efforts, we do have a Transit Equity and Modernization Committee, or a TEMC. This is a group that acts kind of as an advisory group to the study. We have 12 transit CEOs across the Commonwealth who serve on this committee, and we've had a few meetings thus far. We will have one more here in the spring with that group. We also have 4 technical working groups, or TWGs, which we've consolidated a couple of those topic areas into just a single technical working group, specifically the infrastructure and accessibility working groups. We felt like there was some synergy between those topics. And then also with technology and electrification, we consolidated those. The members of these technical working groups are transit agency staff. So it's not the CEOs or anyone necessarily in a leadership role. It's more so the individuals in the maintenance department, the planning department, and they're more departmental staff. But these groups are pretty large. I think we have anywhere between 20 and 40 participants in each of our technical working groups. And like the TEMCs, they've been meeting periodically throughout the study process. We've also held a number of stakeholder meetings to give our transit stakeholders a briefing on our progress to date with the study. There was a strong supporting group of House Resolution 542, and so we felt like we owed it to that group to update them on the study's progress, and so we've had a handful of meetings with them. And then we've also been on a roadshow doing agency briefings all over the Commonwealth. I think we've done 30 to 40 briefings thus far, and we have more plans this spring to just raise awareness of the study and let everybody know what we're working on. And then here in the third column, what we have coming up, I mentioned earlier that we're really in the weeds right now with our study action plan. We're hoping to have a draft action plan probably by the end of next month in April. Next month, we will also be doing a virtual transit forum. This will be a public event to raise awareness of the study and provide a study update on some initial findings with the study. And then again, August, we are using this with the final study reports to the General Assembly. And then I mentioned earlier that we do have a study website with a number of resources. We actually have two domains. We have vatransitequity.com and vatransitmodernization.com. It routes you to the same website, but if you'd like more detailed information on any of this, there's good info here. There's a baseline condition technical memorandum that I mentioned earlier on the website, as of the interim study report and an executive summary. We have an interactive story map, which kind of summarizes all the work that we've done thus far in a more interactive format. And then right now we have a Share Your Transit Story campaign that we're running, where we are soliciting sound bites and stories from transit riders throughout Virginia on how transit has impacted them. All right, so that leads me to the initial findings. And I will preface this section by just saying that we have a number of findings. It would take all day to go through them with this group. We pulled out the ones that we thought were most relevant to discussion of this act. So just wanted for you all to be aware of that. So I mentioned earlier on that one of the things that we wanted to look at was transit service coverage and do a gap analysis. This map here on the screen is the transit service coverage in Virginia in 2021. The darker purple is where fixed route transit currently exists. The lighter purple is where fixed route service does not exist, but demand responsive transit exists. So you can see there are some gaps scattered throughout the Commonwealth where there is no transit at all. We then overlaid fixed route transit service needs on top of this map. We calculated the needs based on population density and employment density to figure out where the gaps were. What we found out was that approximately 1 million Virginians need fixed route transit service, but currently do not have access to it. And over 500,000 jobs in Virginia are not currently served by fixed route transit, but they should be. We have also, like, taking out the needs completely, we also looked just to see how many Virginians just don't have any access to fixed route transit, and how many Virginians do not have access to, or how many jobs do not have access to fixed route transit. And it's closer to 4 million Virginians don't have any access to transit, and I think it's 3 million jobs don't have access by fixed route transit. So I think the relevance here for this group is regarding our operating formula. I think it was teed up in the previous presentation. The operating formula incentivizes efficiency and ridership. It doesn't necessarily incentivize transit agencies to provide more service coverage. And so just something to think about. We're not going to get deep in the weeds in this presentation, but certainly in May and June, as we tackle our operating formula, we need to really think through whether or not we want to provide more incentives for our transit agencies to provide more coverage-based services. Also talked about in the last presentation was the bus stop infrastructure. The DRPT team actually used a tool that was developed by Kimley Horn, our consultants, to do a sampling and assessment of some bus stops in Virginia. We have over 15,000 bus stops in Virginia, and we almost sampled 700, just under 700. And we were looking for what amenities are currently at the bus stop, and what are the conditions of the bus stop and the physical infrastructure at the bus stop. So just some highlights from that assessment. We found that 89% of bus stops did not have a shelter. We found that 81% of bus stops did not have a bench. 50% of the bus stops did not have lighting nearby. 33% of the bus stops did not have an ADA ramp nearby, and 21% of bus stops were not adjacent to sidewalks. The 21% figure stood out to me. I thought it was actually going to be higher. I thought it was going to be closer to 40%. As we dug into the data a little bit, the concentration of bus stops in the central business districts within our cities, there's just way more bus stops downtown. And downtown typically has more sidewalks. So that's what we found was that really this figure was drawing on the fact that, you know, those densely populated areas tend to have sidewalks and also. And so we also were able to look at some trends with this data. We found that the likelihood of a bus stop having a shelter, bench, indoor lighting increases as you get closer to the central business district, as I just mentioned. Urban bus stops are also more likely to be adjacent to sidewalks. 91% of bus stops appear to be in a state of good repair. So what we did in our assessment was we looked at the physical infrastructure at each bus stop. So if it was a bus stop and it was just in grass, but it had a sign and a pole, we looked at the pole and the sign. Were they in disrepair? If it was not, it looked like a fairly decent bus stop pole and sign, we would mark that as in a state of good repair. And that was the majority of bus stops. And so that was good news. That we didn't think that, generally speaking, that the shelters and the benches and signs were in bad shape. Generally, they were in good shape. We also found that the rural bus stops are more likely to be inaccessible, so not have access to a sidewalk, and they were also more likely to have SGRD. So rural agencies, their physical infrastructure at the bus stops are not in as good a shape as those in more urban environments. And then after our assessment, we asked our consultants to help us get a total cost estimate of what it would take to install basic transit infrastructure, so shelters, benches, and lighting at all bus stops in Virginia, and that's the net increase. So it's not to like replace existing assets, it's just how do we get the ones that currently are not up to par, get them up to par. And so we estimated that would cost roughly $250 million. Sticking with infrastructure, but switching gears to transit vehicles, we wanted to take a look at just the growth in statewide transit vehicles throughout the Commonwealth. What this chart shows is that it has been growing since 2009. It seems like each year we tend to add more transit buses to our statewide fleet. The breakdown in colors here is a little weird. The yellow is labeled as enhanced fixed route providers. Generally speaking, this is all the Northern Virginia Transit Agency, GRTC, and Hampton Roads Transit. And then the blue, the lighter blue, is pretty much everyone else that provides fixed route service, so the smaller urban areas. What we found by looking at this was that, yes, it's growing, but most of the growth has actually been concentrated outside of those enhanced fixed route providers. It's been in the smaller urban environment. So the Blacksburg Transits of the world, Harrisonburg, WADA, the kind of smaller urban providers have seen an increase in their transit vehicles over time. Specifically, it was about 700 vehicles that we added to the statewide transit fleet in the 10-year span. And there was one other thing I wanted to point out here. Oh, yeah. So, of course, I know all of you know this, but just I guess re-emphasize that when you add a bus to the statewide fleet, that is going to be an SGR need in the future. It might be an expansion now, but as that asset retires, it becomes an SGR. Sure.
When you say that most of the growth is in the smaller urban areas, is that in investments or percentage?
Both. So it's kind of hard to see on this visual, but if you look at the yellow, I mean, it's roughly 1,500 buses that we had in 2009 in those areas. And it's roughly about the same. I mean, those areas have certainly added vehicles to their fleet, but most of that 700 is coming from the smaller.
good choice of colors to improve, given international affairs these days.
So, so again, sticking with the vehicles, and I know Mark pointed out some of this in his presentation, but looking at the age and the condition of our statewide transit vehicles, and comparing them to nationwide, what the numbers stack up. On the left here, you have the nationwide percentage of vehicles at or beyond their useful life benchmark. That is that light blue, and that's a 20% figure. And then the darker blue is the buses that are in a state of good repair. So they have not yet met their useful life benchmark. And similar to what Mark said again, with vehicles specifically, we are doing better, a little bit better than the national average with respect to age and condition of our buses. And then we also did the same analysis with our facilities. And here we're actually doing much better than the national average. Nationwide facilities at or beyond their useful life benchmark is 12%, but we're hovering right around the 4% mark here.
Great, quick question. Sure. And I apologize, I missed it. Is WMATA included in these numbers or excluded?
No, and thank you for mentioning that.
They get swayed all over the place.
Yes, and I think Mark's numbers actually did include WMATA, so ours are a little bit different than his. And yours also grouped together all assets, not even break it out, at least in presentation by vehicles and facilities. But the House Joint Resolution 542, which created this study, specifically called out that WMATA was not to be included.
That is actually totally makes sense, especially for the audience.
Yep. So switching gears a little bit to transit electrification. I know many of you probably already know this, but just to highlight some of the benefits of transit electrification, or potential benefits. They have zero tailpipe emissions. They are also less noisy and have fewer vibrations. So if you ever stood next to an electric bus, it's a totally different experience standing next to it compared to its diesel counterpart. The third bullet here, the jury I think is still out on this one. Some research suggests that electric buses are cheaper to operate and maintain than diesels. I caveat that with there's just not a whole lot of data out there yet. The first generation electric buses are just retiring right now. And those were put in service 12, 13 years ago, and there weren't a whole lot of them. And so over the next few years, we're going to start to get more data on what the total life cycle cost of maintaining and operating a battery electric bus is. And so it'll be really interesting to take a look at that data. I know we have 3 agencies in Virginia which currently operate electric buses, those being Blacksburg Transit. We also have Hampton Roads Transit, as well as DAC.
If I could just for the group, because we've actually included having folks from Dash come and speak. The Transportation Commission, we're really diving into this on behalf of our region to really understand some stuff, and some of the information, because I know there's a lot of excitement with electrification, but I do know that a lot of our systems are looking at how it works when you're talking about hills in winter. Just to think about, and that sounds very basic, but the idea of how many miles you can get out of a vehicle will depend if you have the heater on, and will depend if you have hills going up, never mind roofs and things like that. So we've got a working group already together. We find that there's going to probably be some really good economies of scale with information sharing, as well as potentially infrastructure sharing within Northern Virginia. But I know there's a lot of excitement about electrification, but I think there's a lot of complexity that once you start peeling down, and part of it is just because I know people get very, very excited. It is not as simple. It's not like you can take an existing diesel bus and say, I'm just going to replace it with one electric vehicle and perhaps get the same service. And so I want to say buyer beware. It's really great. It's very, very exciting. All this federal money for this and other zero emission, but there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be tested in this space. I just felt I needed to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. They are a totally different animal. And to your point, the range of a battery electric bus is, mean, it can't operate the way a diesel bus does, where you fill up the tank overnight and then just let it do its thing all day, and then you fill it up again the next night. These have limitations on their range. And to your point, you know, the climate has an impact, the terrain has an impact. There's just so many different things that can impact battery range.
Yes, this is likely to be a moving target all along, though, isn't it? Because of all the work that's being put into new battery technologies that are lighter batteries and different technologies that don't have some of the same problems that the current battery.
Because that is also a procurement challenge for
Yes.
transit systems. When do you buy? When do you start looking to this if you know that the next technology is going to come out? So it's definitely interesting and moving.
And our consultants, CTE, who's helped us dive into this, they did say that while the battery capacity, the technology is certainly getting better. Year over year, it keeps getting better. But the cost kind of started to level out, and they're not anticipating that the costs are going to dramatically increase anytime soon. So just another thing to be aware of. So the current statewide transit fleet, we have over 2,500 revenue vehicles here in Virginia, and only 1% of them are currently electric. I mentioned the agencies that currently operate those vehicles. I think the big thing that we've kind of rolled our sleeves up with here is what will be the impact to our funding programs, our capital funding programs in particular, as our transit agencies start transitioning their fleets to electric. So we haven't completed it, but we're currently doing a statewide transition plan just to understand what those costs and all the implications are. Some preliminary figures here. We have estimated that the incremental cost, so this is the net increase cost to transition our entire transit fleet to electric, is expected to be $800 million. That's $800 in new money. Additionally, it's not just the vehicle, it's all the infrastructure that's involved. We are estimating it'll take about $300 million to design, upgrade, and install just the charging infrastructure. That number is probably even a little low because some agencies are going to have to completely retrofit their facilities to accommodate electric vehicles. So it is not.
Yeah, and it's like, because it's the charging structure, but I know we're looking at electric vehicles, and our maintenance yard can't do that. We're not set up to do that. So that's an interesting thought. One of the questions I had was sort of like, I know Dominion Energy Virginia is doing electric school buses, and they're working with us to plug up and feed back into that, and so they're fronting some of the costs. Is that happening in transit buses? And then how will the federal infrastructure money for EV charging across the nation impact this? We talk federal money for capital, but would it also factor into this on the transit side?
We'll put a pin in that last point, because I do have a slide on some of the federal, the LONA funding that we talked about much earlier. On the Dominion side, I mean, to be honest, I don't think that Dominion's doing a whole lot. I mean, we've had some conversations.
Yeah,
with them.
we've had some conversations with Dominion. Dominion, for the first tranche of electric buses that came in for using federal money came into HRT. And so Dominion was really helpful in working with HRT on what type of improvements to make to the facility. They made some recommendations that actually saved HRT a lot of money, just in the placement of those electric vehicles on their line and, relative to the power grid. They have done some, they set up some, not grants, it's like a voucher or a credit that they've been, trying to work with the transit agencies to help offset some of that, infrastructure costs. So I think they're eager to partner with the transit agencies in the same way as they have with the school buses. I hear from them about every couple of months. I've heard from them a lot recently since all this federal money has been.
Yeah.
So I would say that they're eager to partner with the transit agencies. I think they they don't understand the challenges that Kate has pointed out about how they affect, how it affects how they route the buses and the operations and the climate and the hills and the stuff that impacts how the transit agencies plan to use them.
So how much they can pull the power back off on their seat.
Yes, definitely. They are motivated by how that ties into, their business angle.
But we can capitalize on that.
But it's like, part is also understanding what costs are effectively going to be borne by the city versus price on a locality. And so, for example, if you've got only so much energy coming to that facility and all of a sudden you need a lot more power, how does that work? Is that something you can go to FTA as part of your low note grant and say, oh, I need, $5 million to upgrade, and is that
they have
funding and all this crazy stuff?
They have an innovation group that has indicated in the past that they're very willing to help do those things in their service territory.
The Dominion Power Innovation Group.
The Dominion Power.
Sorry.
Compared to FTA, be clear, Dominion. I mean, so like if you guys want to hear about what Dominion's doing and wants to do with electric transit, I guarantee you that they're probably watching TSDAC today. If we can get them here, we can have them talk. We did a joint webinar with them. We were in this room, so it had to have been 2 years ago on transit electrification and kind of what we could do with the VW funding that we had at that point in time and what Dominion could do to help. We've had some conversations with Appalachian Power as well, because Dominion covers a lot of the state, but they don't cover the whole state. So, we've had some of those conversations, but yeah, it's not quite to where the school bus conversation has come.
I can see it feeding into strategic plans and future capital and changing our thresholds for analysis and all of that. But maybe it's not a total factor this go round, but I can see it's something we need to keep our eyes out on.
Yeah, and the impact on our capital programs will be significant. An electric bus generally costs almost as much as double that of a diesel bus.
That's what we're finding.
Yeah, this is going to be a big topic for us. In the emerging technology space, we heard from our conversations with our transit agencies that DRPT does play a critical role in the testing and deployment of emerging technologies through our technical assistance, through our grants and funding for technologies, so our demo program, and then also in state contracting and cooperative purchase agreements. However, when we did our survey, we also asked transit agencies, what technologies are you currently using? And we found that there's much room for improvement. Some technologies that we think of as industry standard didn't have as much penetration within the state as we thought there would. Specifically, just to name a few, only 8% of our transit agencies currently use contactless fare payments. Only 34% use real-time vehicle tracking, and then only 5% have implemented mobility on-demand services. So what we heard, we also asked, why haven't you deployed some of these technologies, and we just heard that additional resources are needed. So technical assistance and funding.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Jamie's point.
So I guess just to recap some of the last few slides, bus stop infrastructure and amenities is certainly lagging behind. There's a need for improved bus stop infrastructure. Our vehicle fleet keeps expanding, which is going to put some pressure on our SGR needs and available revenues down the road. We also have electrification looming, which is going to stress our program. And then we also have technology, which we want to modernize our systems, but those agencies need more funding to do so. So we have all these needs, and just the graphic here on the right was a representation of those needs stacked up against anticipated state revenues. We'll also caveat this one that this graphic was put together as part of the baseline conditions report and does not include the new revenue forecast. And it was also done with the original 6-year program from FY23 to 27. So there's a little change here, but as you can see, outpacing the available revenues for the foreseeable future. First bullet point here, and it was mentioned by Jen earlier on, in December, the CTV did help reduce the capital backlog by adding some additional funding to the program. The capital backlog obviously still exists, and all of this just makes the prioritization of our capital projects so important. I just wanted to leave you all with that, and then I have two other slides here. We talked about FTA funding earlier on, and specifically the bus and bus facilities program and the low and no emissions program. This is something that keeps getting brought up throughout our study efforts also, is how competitive Virginia has historically been with these federal discretionary programs. So what we did was we looked back at the last 5 years of federal discretionary funding to see how much of that has gone to Virginia compared to all the other states. This is a representation of that.
Yeah.
So you can see there in red towards the bottom, right ahead of South Dakota. Nothing against South Dakota, but we've only pulled in $6.2 million from the bus and bus facilities program since 2016, which is incredibly low. This is out of $1.7 billion that has been available. Again, this program is the FY22 funding was announced late last week. And so this program is active right now, and we're trying to identify agencies that we can partner with on submitting.
Just a question, I'm assuming it means also that we didn't apply.
Well,
If we were not successful, it's that we also didn't apply, right?
And I think that's the issue. And I know from the letters of support that we write that many of the applicants the systems that do apply get the funding. It's just a matter of our systems are not applying at the rate that they should be.
And if I could, in some ways, not maybe actually my colleagues here, but I know at least for our folks, the fear of getting into that federal space means potentially having to hire a whole bunch of people just to manage the federal grant. And that's a really intimidating thing.
But you know, the ability to supplement the state resources that we have with federal funds is huge. And as you can see, we're definitely
we're less than
we should.
Guam. We're less than Guam.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
And the story is the same for the low and no emissions program. We are just from the bottom at 2.7, just over $2.7 million coming from the Commonwealth out of $409 million. Kate mentioned this earlier on. There's the low-no program is out there right now as well with the bus and bus facilities. There is $1.5 billion just available this year. That's more than they've allocated combined over the last, however many years. So there is so much low-no funding that's out there. And actually, I've looked and for FY20, I guess, FTA only received $900 million worth of applications for the low-no program. So they could have funded everything in FY20 with the current amount of funds.
And that sort of begs the question, though. Is there a need here for us to have some more state money put in to make available to the localities who can't reach out to do this? Because if we invest a small amount of money to help them, the return could be very significant. Is that something that we should be looking at proposing?
We actually are going to hire somebody to be a grant writer, and one of the purposes is to help our grantees prepare applications. And so that's one way we're at least hoping we can help in the correct submittal of grant applications. In terms of managing the grants, I understand that's a concern, but also when you look at the amount of money that we're leaving on the table.
Is that something that when we make these reports to JLARC reports, are we saying to the gentleman Sunday, look, if you guys invest X amount of dollars here to help us with small localities who can't afford to do what Northern Virginia's doing or what some others are doing?
But in Northern Virginia localities, many of them don't want to play in this because it does mean it's not about the grant application. It's actually about the fact you're actually going to now have to do a triennial review, which is of every single dollar and every single activity that your organization does. It is a huge
Well, there's two components.
Right.
One is us applying for money
Right.
sitting on the
And
table.
then making sure that,
Way. The other is maybe we ought to have a parallel sort of congressional effort to address, finding some relief for this,
right.
Review process.
But I
what have
agree,
you.
this is money that should be.
Because this is money that's
Yeah,
sitting
it
on the
just does
table,
fund
we're
the
not taking
technical-
advantage of that. It makes
Not
no
the
sense.
technical assistance, so apply, but then it's the reporting, the single audit, the procurement, the NEPA. I mean, federal money is wonderful, but it's work.
But the other,
They're heading in the right direction.
I think the other thing, and we touched on this earlier, is like, this represents us received one award, and that was to HRT. One or two. Okay. But all of the awards we've received have leveraged funding out of the merit program. And so that's something that this group can do with revisiting the capital program, is how can we incentivize the capital prioritization to flip that, instead of going to the state first and using federal to fill in, how do we incentivize going to the feds first and using state to fill in, to make the match requirement?
Yeah, and that was the point that I was going to make, is that there has to be an incentive. Like, yes, you have to apply, but you also have to convince the transit agency that it's worth it. So currently, pretty much all of our vehicles, I'm just focusing on vehicles right now, but most of the vehicles that are funded in Virginia, it's a 4% local match. It doesn't matter who's filling out the rest of the 96%, whether it's federal or state. The agencies themselves, they don't care if it's federal or state. They just know that they have to provide the 4% local match, which is the minimum amount. Problem is they're coming to the state. They see the state, our merit program, it's easier to apply. They're familiar with it. You don't need to hire a grant writer to go after the funding necessarily. So they usually come to us first and then fill out the gap with whatever federal funds they have, with the exception of Northern Virginia agencies. To Jen's point, we need to somehow find a way in our process to flip that and encourage agencies to go after the federal first, use our funding as match, which then helps the entire statewide program. So we're going to have some recommendations in our next conversation next month, where we're going to dive into this a little bit more.
Yeah, I have one other question. I want to go back to this bus stop thing. I was interested, how much feedback did you get from people who commented on, we were reluctant to use or wait for a bus, for example, because there's no lighting there at nighttime? I just wondered, was there any feedback at all on that? Because I would think that might pose some problems for some people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we, in the rider focus groups, we heard loud and clear that they found the bus stop infrastructure to be unacceptable. From a safety perspective, it wasn't waiting for their bus at the bus stop. And so yeah, we heard it from focus group members. We also heard it from the transit agencies themselves and stakeholders. It is a problem. So again, that's something that we can probably address with some of our prioritization efforts and how we score.
I would think, so are we looking at how we might be able to get some more funding to help go to localities to help address that?
I mean, one thing that we did find out was that there are some underutilized existing funding sources that help with bus stop improvements. Specifically talking about some funding that flows through our NPOs and their transportation alternatives program. This is typically it's for bike and ped projects, but bus stop improvements are also an eligible expense. I don't know if we funded any bus stop improvements for any of our NPOs in the Commonwealth through the transportation alternatives program. In terms of new funding, I may defer to Jennifer, whether that would be something that we could even do, go to the General Assembly and ask for.
Well, it also begs the question, I mentioned earlier about us having other agencies aware of how all this stuff relates, going back to whether or not there might be some housing or planning monies available to address that, because it's one thing to have housing and make it available, but even if you tie it into transit, if you've got horrible transit stations and nobody's using them, then it really is counterproductive. So, all these things tie together. So there may be some other pools of creative money we can start exploring to help address this particular problem. It's just a thought, that's all.
Yeah, but it wasn't built into this presentation, but we do have some recommendations from the study to talk about better coordination with the land use planners at the local level that are looking at, where to place housing and affordable housing, because there's certainly communication breakdown, I think, and a lot of room for improvement there.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to follow up on Jim's point, and then one of my comments or questions. I think that takes me back to the discussion of working with the localities and VDOT on smart scale and revenue sharing, because that's where we do a lot of those bus stops, sidewalk. We're going to be doing the intersection stuff, and you can add it. The picture on the slide that shows the bus stop assessment brings me back to Dominion, because there's a blooming pole in the middle of the sidewalk, which is one of our biggest issues that we're trying to deal with, is you need the accessibility to the whole route, and you got a pole in the middle of it, so you have an ADA compliance issue. And depending on a locality, you may have negotiated a franchise agreement with Dominion to use our right-of-way. So, for example, at their cost, if I say it's an ADA issue, they have to move the pole. And there's never one pole, right, because you got to do it in a string. But I have to provide the right-of-way. That's usually okay, because we're going to widen the sidewalk or narrow the street for traffic calming. So to the whole planning piece, you can integrate it. So that was just sort of a reaction to your comment. That same slide, so thank you for flipping back to it. The lighting is always an issue because of the expense of, well, for one, most localities, we're not going to do above ground anymore. We want undergrounding for the pedestrian walkway, even more expensive. So I think we need to look at solar and how we can integrate solar, and especially some of these rural places where you're going to have long lines in between bus stops. And then from a locality's perspective, I also have to ask the transit agencies to work with us when you're going to change bus stops. Because if we put in a shelter, which we've done, granted, I'm going to be talking WMATA, which is the rest of everybody, they changed the route after I went for a grant, and I have beautiful shelters. I got lights, I got trash cans, I got bike, I got the concrete pads, and they changed it. I have 3 bus stops for this beautiful shelter for which they put up signs for 3 months that the bus stop moved. And now I've got people calling us angry because there is a shelter, but I'm not going to pay to move a $15,000 infrastructure now, because my luck is bus stop's going to change again because the route's going to get redone. So it's that coordination piece. It kind of goes both ways. We can help improve the bus stop, but then if you're going to change it, we kind of need to plan in advance, not all of a sudden get a notice and a little corrugated sign put up by my transit provider. But, it's the shelters, and we did that because it really is important for people. That's what we kept hearing. We're not using it because we're not going to stand in the rain while we wait for a 20-minute headway. So, yeah, I'm glad to see it as part of the accessibility, but it is challenging when you put in the shelter and then the stop actually moves.
Yeah, it is very much a safety issue as well. I mean, in my community, we've had over the course of the last 3 months, I would say, 2 instances in which one person was actually killed crossing over a busy street to get to a bus stop that was not at an intersection or a lighted location, and another person who was seriously injured getting off the bus where the truck came and hit them as they were trying to cross the street. So obviously some big issues here. I wonder whether there's any opportunity in terms of, the grant writing position, I think is a great addition that would be helpful. And I know that we're looking at improved technology in terms of programming for gathering and analyzing data. I wonder if there's any opportunity to do some kind of acquisition of software that might assist in the federal process for localities that are reluctant to expend that, or whether that's already available. People just don't know about it.
I think it'd be helpful for us. I know there's a wide range of reasons that the Northern Virginia systems don't use federal, and some of them, very valid reasons that have to do also with how they allocate funds to WMATA. And so I think it's a whole host of issues, but I think their greatest concern is that complying with some of the labor requirements will also just increase the overall operating costs to which they have to bear. And so I know that is a very big concern that they have about using federal funds. It's not, in addition to the cost of compliance with the federal requirements.
And it's not data necessarily, but I think what was mentioned earlier on that in order to even qualify for LONO, an agency must include a transition plan. This is a new requirement. And so that could be something that's something that we want to help with is the development of those transition plans. Certainly if they can't be done in-house, can we assist, whether it be through technical assistance or, use some of our bench contractors to kind of help with that.
And just, Mr. Chair, if I may, on just the expenditures of funding, for our transit strategic plan, we actually did put in what vehicles we should be using moving forward and what that actually looks like. Because as of right now, based on, and I've worked for 3 transit agencies, everybody knows that it's not a big deal, but we have seen the aftermath of getting a grant, and it really wasn't a good idea. So I can't say the agency, some of these vehicles can't convince me to buy it because I have seen the problem. So I do want to put that out of as part of our strategic plan. I wouldn't go after this money if you paid me because I've seen the bad things. So as these technologies develop and, we get infrastructure, because our maintenance facility is in the middle of nowhere, so trying to get something, infrastructure there in some of the counties, they're not giving me a permit anyway. But I would just say, when you're looking at discretionary funds and why agencies haven't done it, it may be because we just, at this point, one, don't have enough information, which is why I'm using my PSP to figure that out. And 2, until vehicles just get better, I have seen the aftermath, so that's just the transparency of it all. So you got 3 agencies to pick from, so you can't tell me. You can't say I picked that one.
I could envision some things if I was college review on this.
I'm just letting you know I don't want y'all to feel like, oh my gosh, there's money left on the table. Some of us don't want that money until we know a strategy to actually affect. So technical assistance is one thing, but just to help this group out when you're saying, hey, and the transit agency's heads are going to tell you, oh, this is great, but I was a worker, so workers know what workers know. And so that's another thing. Don't be too stressed about us being at the bottom, because the maintenance folks will tell you something different than maybe leadership would, which is why we're at the bottom. So.
And Jamie, to that point, I mean, we've just recompeted our DOC contract, and we put an electric option in there. And, you talk about a vehicle that's good for 4 years or 7 years, and the cost difference, it's a lot. And sometimes I just feel that and like our staff's going out to Sunny Merriman next week to look at these vehicles and talk to them about them, because there's a lot of apprehension about, like, even within the vendor contracting piece of what do these vehicles mean, how do we support them, that, ties right into what you said. Who's going to want to go first?
Yeah, and Fred will have. But
it's an example, because if you talk to Dominion has 2 or 3 of them that they run around downtown Richmond to shuttle their employees around, or they did before the pandemic. And they're like, see, they work. And I'm like, you're running in a 3 or 4 block radius, and you have the charger in your building. So there's a difference there, and I think that's one of the things where we can bring the tools, but there has to be that trade-off with the folks that are the workers that know whether something is the right choice or not the right choice.
We have to be able to address that problem, because it seems to me at some point you're going to have to get more money. So either we're going to have to get some of the money sitting on the table, or we're going to have to address the problem you presented. Otherwise, we have to come up with money from somewhere. We don't have a printing press around the way it's going to look. So we've got to figure out a way to address this one way or the other. Because ultimately, it all comes down to where do we get the funds to provide the services that people need.
I think some of it ties back to the slide that Grant did on emerging technology and why some of these technologies that seem like, touchless fare payment and mobility on demand and real-time vehicle tracking that seem like, well, like why doesn't everybody have that? There's that apprehension there, and I think those are things we can help with, but at the end of the day, we don't run the system, and the systems are going to have to figure out what fits best with what they do, and I think that's where the strategic planning piece that we talked about earlier kind of comes back into the loop.
And if I could, one of the really nice things to see, especially with that, what we're calling the low-no program, very jargony, but this FTA major massive grant program, it's a 5-year authorization. So this is just the first year, right? And so this is because I actually was sharing your message a little bit earlier, but not as passionate as you. But there will be a lot of our systems are trying to figure out what works best for their system. So it might be year 3 or 4 that they may be going to seek that. We have a system in our area that did a lot of hybrid buses, and they did not perform. And so they are dealing with buses not getting the useful life, which has a whole bunch of other things because they're trying to get them replaced before they expected to be replaced. It's all working out in the end, but being on the bleeding edge is a very difficult place when you're dealing with public money. And so I think the other thing I just want to throw in there will be there's an increasing community who successfully competes for this, because having these strategic plans for implementation of zero and no emission vehicles as a part of the criteria to apply, I'd be interested to see how many transit agencies actually have that, unless they have enough money to throw to consultants to put it together in 60 days, right? So.
I think I'll just throw out two, and I'm going to jump on Jamie's bandwagon. I've worked for 3 transit agencies as well, so I'm not calling it. But you also have to think about the local support as well. That's been a barrier in the past, so I'll narrow it down to 2. You just don't have the local support to take on these initiatives, whether it be transitioning the fleet or the potential increased expense that's going to come along with it, because 4% on 500,000 is a lot different than 4% on $1 million. So that's just something else to be thinking about in this conversation as well.
And I would say on the strategy piece, and this goes back to maybe even before, because I was looking at the JLAB presentation about how I can be basically a legislative advocate within by pulling pieces of information, because nobody's going to listen to me, but they'll listen to you because you do studies. You're brilliant. But, well, maybe you're not, you just,
Yeah, that's smart people that they do the work.
But I guess my point more is, on Brian's comment, my leadership, and so I'm a department of the city, he's telling me, Jamie, you're going to buy electric vehicles. And so now what I'm doing is, where's my money? Show me the 4% of that $1 million. Well, we just want to make sure it gets done. Show me the money today. And now not only show me the money, how am I going to maintain those vehicles? How am I going to make sure that that battery is actually going to work for this useful life? So what I'm doing now is strategically saying, you will do whatever you want me to do, but I don't want you to fire me in 2 years because it didn't work out the way you wanted me to do it. So I think, that outreach piece on really what is the cost of it, like what is the true cost, so that we can do it and we can maintain it. But the local support, especially when you're using more than one or have more than one jurisdiction involved, is that 4% is okay for the capital expense, but operating and maintaining that vehicle, they do not want to pay. But everybody wants an electric bus, which is great, but, so that, my point is more just that communication strategy so that we can not only get the vehicle, but actually tell the story of really what it's going to cost so that they can plan for it. Because even now with Fare Free, thank you for the trip program, they're like, whoa. And we get less than $100,000, $200,000 in fare box revenue. Well, who's going to pay for that money? You got $10 million. Why are you worried about $100,000 as a drop in the bucket? And they want people to pay in certain localities. And I'm like, so we still need to be able to tell that full story, because there's a cost that sometimes they don't want to pay, but they want the benefit of it. So That was my long story today. I'll just tell that story.
Telling the story is important because I'm one of those locals that have to convince some elected people to pay. It's telling the story, and so not all of us, a lot of us have visions and policies around greenhouse gas emissions or the economic development or putting the housing close to so you have less congestion. So we're just telling the whole story and cross-pollinating, because if we stay siloed, it's not going to. But I think that's also, in my mind, it also helps us get the riders back. And if you get the riders back and you see less cars, then you can say, see, there's a benefit. Yeah, your 4% just went up. But it's a cost benefit on another side of the locality's ledger.
But I'm going to add to that. I mean, the pressure that my board members in their locality to go immediately 100% electric is there. And so we're doing everything we can to get them as smart on all of this as quick as we can, because the pressure is real. I mean, we have a discretionary program that there have been conversations saying we're not going to approve anything unless that's an electric bus that's being bought. And this would be a kind of a rogue bus in a whole other system. So the pressure is real on the elected officials to be showing immediately, and this is not immediate. And so I think that if we can keep talking strategic plans, smart use of investments, how we can time this, all that stuff, integrated, and all that good stuff, I think is going to be really, really important, because I don't think any of us want to see a bunch of vehicles that are sidelined, not serving the customer, and breaking down after 4 years. Like, that is a disaster. And so I guess we are definitely trying to get really, really smart to make strategic investments and not hasty ones.
I think that's really important. I mean, that's why the City of Falls Church does not run our own bus. We had George. We had a federal grant for this hybrid bus system. Wrong bus. We couldn't maintain it. We couldn't operate it. It didn't have good routes. We didn't have riders. And then all of a sudden, no grant, and there's not enough support behind it to keep it going. And thank you, Arlington County, for buying the buses off of us, because we would have had a large payback to FTA when we stopped running the buses. They have a little different paint on them now, but they had enough fleet that they could merge these, 4-road buses into two, whatever I had for George.
Well, go back to this slide, because I don't know if I made it clear when I did the presentation, but the Bus and Bus Facilities Program does pay for diesel buses as well. So just wanted to make that clear. I know we've had a lot of conversation about the electric buses, but there's also money for diesel. So.
And the one thing I'll say, wrapping back around and talking about the grant writer and sort of flipping the script on, instead of coming to the state first, having that conversation and flipping the script is going to be helpful to smaller agencies, because we had a conversation in our office this week. We were on a Low-No Bus and Bus Facilities webinar, and the question came up of like, well, do we even apply? What do we apply for? And I said, well, we have nothing in the queue right now. I said, but we just had 5 that we submitted in February. Like, maybe that's something we look at, is just go ahead and submit for those 5 that we submitted to the state in February and have the conversation, which I'm sure Jen would appreciate, because we're actually in the case of, we're looking at potentially a 32% local match, because that's something that is just now surfacing out of the changes in 2018 or 2020, where small urbans lost the ability to have federal funds flex from highway, which was supporting a lot of that small urban program. So I said, do we take the gamble? We know we're going to have at least a 32% local match. Let's take the gamble and see if we can lower that. It doesn't hurt, other than just the staff time. So that was my direction to the staff when it came to that, but flipping the script, like you said, would be helpful.
I think that's going to be a key point of discussion when we look at capital and we'll bring a recommendation on that. How do we incentivize it?
And the answer is yes. Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask Grant or to raise?
Kind of back to the discussion on the amenities and the second presentation you guys mentioned. We need to invest more in them. I think that's really exciting, but as soon as you put in a shelter, a trash can, there's an expectation that someone is cleaning that and maintaining it. And maybe it's the transit agencies taking that responsibility, maybe that's falling on the localities, but there needs to be at least some discussion of the operational costs of these amenities if we are going to look at tweaking the capital funding. Just so we kind of understand.
Yeah, we get a lot of calls when there's fingerprints and old posters on the shelter. And right now, we're only budgeted to clean them twice a year, and that's not enough, so you've got a good point on the operating.
So if you, at the same point, if you can fund money, because we've got smart scale, we've got 30 benches for shelters for us to put in, not a nickel, in our budget, well, now it is in our budget this year, but we didn't have any money to keep it. So now it's probably $1,000, $1,200 per year per stop. And so even if ERPT in the future funds operating costs just for shelter and bench maintenance, that would be great, because even if you do rely on the locality, we're not going to always do it. They're not thinking about that bus stop, just because they've got so much other things to do, their public work. So that would just be something as part of this process, if we do focus on that at this point. Can we get additional funding to maintain it? Because everybody wants this, everybody wants a shelter. But in some cases, we don't want to put the trash can out, so we got to pick it up.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions for us to be addressing on the accessibility side of it is to see if there's any creative opportunities for the ability to deal with exactly the question that Cindy raised, which is that you put a shelter up and then there are changes. And so is there a way in which you can easily at least transfer infrastructure you've made an investment in to a revised route structure and leave the old spots a safe location for people to walk? Or
Yeah, I can guarantee you, we'd leave the concrete pad there. We're not putting that up. It'll be there the next time Metro decides to move the bus stop.
Right, yeah. But so unless I hear otherwise, we've I think demonstrated some benefits of in-person meetings today, because people have had lots of conversation opportunities to discuss some important items. I didn't get a chance when Director Mitchell came in to acknowledge her coming in.
Sorry.
Thought I'd just say that if you'd like to add anything to what's been a good discussion tonight.
No, I'm sorry to be leaving the RPT soon, but was that a?
No,
Oh, sorry. So, I announced yesterday that I will be leaving to join FRA as the new deputy administrator there. So, yeah, I'm very excited. So my last day will be on Friday of next week. I'll be starting there on April 11th. Jen will be coming in as DOPT director.
Oh, congratulations to you.
No, I take that all for you.
Oh, okay. We guys talked about it while I was at
No, we didn't talk about it at all.
Okay.
We just went right to work.
So no, I'm sad to be leaving, but I'm really excited about this next opportunity.
Well, can I just say that from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of TSDAC, it has been an absolute pleasure to work with you through all of this, and I think a very important kind of job. We've benefited an awful lot from your leadership and the kind of direction that you've been able to provide for us and for the agency. I know you'll bring the same kind of commitment, intelligence, and passion to the job you're going to take on, and appreciate everything you've done.
Thank you, and I'm excited. One of the things I'll be working on actually is they want me to focus on implementation of the infrastructure bill on the rail side. So I'm excited about that. So, but I could not be more thrilled to be leaving DRPT in such good hands also.
Oh, and I think we'll second that sense that we're very, very excited to work with Jen in her capacity.
Done a super job.
Oh, thank you.
I've had a chance to work with you from Ramada, from the
CTV.
So it's going to be a big loss, but if it has to be replaced, you couldn't find a better person.
Well, thank you.
John.
I'm very excited.
I'm very excited. I had exchanged a few text messages with Cheryl Openshaw last night. I'm like, I'm really grateful that you guys took a chance on me 6 years ago.
Wasn't a stretch.
Coming off the whole CRT project. So, no, I'm very excited. And I am like, I wouldn't have considered it if we didn't have such an amazing team here. And so you'll hear less from me this go around, and you'll hear more from folks like Grant and his team, amongst others, as we go through TSDAC. Really excited. I think I told you last night, I'm really excited to get started with TSDAC again.
Yeah.
As are we.
It's good to be in person and see everybody. It's way better than seeing each other in the box.
Can we give you a round of applause for what you've done?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That's right.
We're only going to hire people named Jen and Jennifer from
Yeah. There's a whole lot of them around here.
Yeah. Dime a dozen.
Kanye and Emily.
Yeah.
There you go. And Grant and Andy and Neil, and yeah, we got a few others.
Yeah, so I think we've covered the next steps. Is that right?
I think so. I was going to ask Haley, because what we did today to kind of keep our numbers in here down was we encouraged people the public that wanted to participate virtually. So we do have public comment on the agenda. So Haley, if you can just check on, go to webinar, see if there's any questions or comments, if there's anybody that would like to be unmuted to speak. I sense that there's a lot of our staff on there too, but they're all. Lisa's got scroll back up. I saw Lisa Guthrie had a question mark by her.
I can't believe you can see that far.
I can't read in front of my face, but I can see that. Difficulty. We're working on the technology.
Sorry about that. This is curiosity, right?
We're working on the technology, so.
So if you have a question at this time or would like to share public comment, please raise your hand in the participant panel and we will unmute your line.
A lot of our friends on there. We're good.
That concludes public comment period.
All right, well then last item I have is adjournment. Anybody else have anything before we do that?
So next meeting is scheduled for April 8th. If that is problematic, I know Kate can't do it because spring break. If it's problematic for anybody else, let me know. We can look at, if we push it out a week, it's then going to shorten up that time between the next two meetings. But I also want to recognize that it's a spring break week for a lot of us with kids in school. So it's coming up.
This is the beginning of my spring break.
No, this is the beginning of spring break. I think we're good.
All right, so adjourn this meeting. Thank you.
All right, Haley, can you take your top one?
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, guys.
So lunch is here. Travis has them out there. If you can't remember what you ordered,